Hey guys, tonight we are going to burrow deep into the frozen earth alongside some of the toughest, most resourceful people who ever swung an axe or sailed a longship. You're about to become a Viking settler, not the horn-helmeted cartoon version, but the real deal. Cold, hungrier, and standing on the shores of a volcanic island with absolutely no idea how you are going to survive the winter. The wind is already cutting through your wool cloak like it personally despises you. The sheep you brought are huddled together, looking at you with that judgmental sheep expression, as if to say, this was your brilliant plan? And honestly, they have a point. Because right now, looking around at this treeless, storm-lashed landscape, you are realizing something terrifying. There is nowhere to hide, no forests to shelter in, no caves convenient enough to matter. Just grass, rock, volcanic soil, and a sky that looks like it is personally preparing to murder you with horizontal sleet. You probably would not survive your first Icelandic winter without what you are about to learn. Most people do not realize that the Vikings were not just raiders and traders. They were architectural geniuses who figured out how to literally disappear into the landscape, building homes so well hidden and so perfectly insulated that they could outlast winters that would kill a modern person in a heated apartment if the power went out. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how this community stretches across time zones. Some of you are winding down after a long day, some of you are sneaking this in during a lunch break, and some of you are in that delicious 2 a.m. insomnia zone where history podcasts become your best friend. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing on that Icelandic shore, and the reality of your situation is sinking in faster than your boots into the boggy ground. The year is somewhere around 870 CE, give or take a decade. Historians still argue about the exact dates of Iceland's settlement, with some suggesting it began slightly earlier based on tephra layers in the soil, those telltale volcanic ash deposits that act like nature's timestamp. What matters to you right now is not the precise year. What matters is that you have burned your bridges, literally, in some cases. You left Norway because staying meant death. Or worse, submission to a king whose idea of consolidating power involved making your family's land his family's land. Harold Fairhair, they are calling him now, though you have some less flattering names in mind. The man unified Norway through a combination of military genius, political marriages, and the kind of ruthless efficiency that makes ambitious men either kneel or flee. You chose to flee, and so here you are, one of the Landnam's men, the Landtakers, standing on ground that no Norwegian has ever farmed, looking at a landscape that seems designed by a hostile god to test human stubbornness. The sagas will later romanticize this moment. They will talk about brave pioneers and the spirit of adventure. They will conveniently leave out the part where you genuinely considered turning the ship around, except the ship is already being dismantled because you need the wood. You need every plank, every beam, every nail. Because here is the dirty little secret of Icelandic settlement that the dramatic paintings never show you. Iceland has almost no trees. Oh, there are some. Scrubby little birch forests cling to sheltered valleys, and when you first spotted them from the ship, your heart lifted. Wood, timber, proper building material. But as you get closer, as you actually walk through these so-called forests, you realize the terrible truth. These birches are not the towering giants of Norwegian fjords. They are twisted, wind-stunted things, rarely taller than a man, often shorter. You could not build a proper longhouse from these trees if you harvested every single one of them. And if you did harvest every single one, you would destroy the fragile ecosystem that is barely holding this island's soil together. Something the settlers will learn the hard way over the coming centuries, stripping Iceland of what little forest cover it has and triggering erosion that the land still has not recovered from 1,000 years later. So the ship gets torn apart. The keel becomes a roof beam. The planks become doors and furniture. The mast, if you are lucky enough to have one worth saving, becomes a central pillar. You are recycling before recycling was cool, except it is not cool. It is desperate. Every piece of imported wood is precious beyond measure. Driftwood becomes currency. When storms wash timber onto the Rangni, beaches, logs that have floated across from Siberia or North America, carried by ocean currents on journeys of thousands of miles. People fight over them. Actual fights. Legal disputes about driftwood rights will clog up Icelandic courts for centuries, but you cannot build an entire house from driftwood and ship scraps. You need walls, you need a roof, you need something that will keep out the wind that never stops, the rain that falls sideways, the snow that buries everything for months at a time. You need to build a house, and you have almost nothing to build it with. Except, you look down at the ground beneath your feet. You feel its springy give, the dense mat of grass roots interwoven with soil, centuries of growth compacted into something surprisingly solid. You remember something your grandfather told you once, about the old ways, about how people built before timber was plentiful, about homes that grew from the earth itself. You kneel down and press your hand into the turf, feeling its cold dampness, its strange resilience. This is what you have to work with, and slowly, impossibly, an idea begins to form. You're not going to build on the land, you are going to build with the land. You are going to dig yourself into this island like a tick into a dog's ear. Sorry, that was a gross metaphor, but it is accurate. You are going to make Iceland itself into your shelter. The grass will be your walls, the earth will be your insulation, the hillside will be your protection against winds that would tear a wooden structure apart. You are going to build a turf house. Now, this is not some desperate improvisation you just invented on that beach. Turf construction has deep roots in Scandinavian history, stretching back long before the Viking Age. In the far northern reaches of Norway, in the Faroe Islands, in Shetland and Orkney, people have been building with turf for generations. It is not glamorous. It is not the impressive timber halls where jarls feast and skalds sing. But it works. It works incredibly well, in fact, for places where timber is scarce and winters are brutal. The basic principle is elegant in its simplicity. Grass, when it grows, creates an interlocking root system that binds soil together into cohesive blocks. Cut these blocks carefully, stack them like bricks, and you have walls that are surprisingly strong and almost impossibly well insulated. The air pockets trapped in the soil and root matrix create natural insulation. The mass of earth moderates temperature swings, staying cool in summer heat and retaining warmth in winter cold. Add a roof of more turf, grown right over a wooden or whalebone frame, and you have created a living building, a structure that actually continues to grow, its grass roof photosynthesizing, its walls settling and compacting into something almost geological over time. The Vikings who settled Iceland did not invent turf construction, but they perfected it. They had to. Survival demanded innovation, and these were people who had already proven themselves among the most adaptable humans on the planet. They had figured out how to sail open boats across the North Atlantic. They had navigated by stars, by the colour of the water, by the flight patterns of birds. They had developed preservation techniques that let them store food for months-long voyages. Building houses from grass and dirt? That was just Tuesday. But there is something else about these turf houses, something beyond mere practicality. They were hidden. From the sea, from a hilltop, sometimes from just a few hundred metres away, a well-built turf house was nearly invisible. The grass roof blended into the landscape. The earth walls looked like natural hillocks. Smoke from the central fire dispersed through the turf, sometimes emerging from the grass itself, rather than a visible chimney. For a people who understood that enemies could appear on the horizon at any moment, whether those enemies were rival, settlers, displaced Irish monks, or the occasional pirate, this camouflage was not accidental, it was strategic. You're not just building a house, you're building a hiding place. And as the first winter storms begin to gather on the horizon, as the temperature drops and the daylight shrinks to a few pale hours, you realise that this hiding place might be the only thing standing between you and a frozen death. The work begins tomorrow. Tonight, you huddle with your family and your thralls. Yes, the Vikings had slaves, we cannot romanticise everything, in whatever temporary shelter you can manage. A sail stretched over some rocks, a hollow scraped into a hillside. Something, anything to get through these first desperate nights. Tomorrow you start cutting turf. Tomorrow you start disappearing into the earth. You did not leave Norway because you wanted to. That needs to be clear from the start. The sagas sometimes paint the land and arms men as adventurers, bold pioneers seeking fortune and glory on distant shores. And sure, some of them were. Some people genuinely craved the horizon, needed to see what lay beyond the known world, but most of you, Most of you left because staying meant death. The Norway you grew up in was not a unified kingdom. It was a patchwork of petty kingdoms, jarldoms, and independent chieftains, each controlling their own stretch of fjord or valley. This sounds chaotic, and it was, but it was a chaos people understood. You knew who your enemies were. You knew which families had blood feuds going back generations. You knew which jarls were expanding their power and which were ripe for the picking. The system had a kind of brutal equilibrium, violence enough to keep things interesting, but enough stability that farms got worked and children got raised. Then Harold came along and ruined everything. Harold Fairhair, or Harold Finehair, depending on which translation you prefer, was probably not actually that fair of hair. Historians still argue about his nickname, whether it referred to his hair colour, his hairstyle, or was simply a later addition to make him sound more kingly. What is not debated is what he did. Starting around 870 CE, Harold began systematically conquering the independent kingdoms of Norway, bringing them one by one under his control. The Battle of Hafrsfjord, fought sometime in the 870s or 880s, there is that scholarly uncertainty again, effectively ended organised resistance to his rule. And here is where it gets personal for you. Harold did not just want to rule Norway, he wanted to own it. The old system, where powerful families held allodial rights, essentially full ownership of their ancestral lands, was a threat to his centralised power. So he changed the rules. Land that families had held for generations suddenly belonged to the king. You could keep farming it, sure, but now you owed taxes. Now you owed military service. Now you were a subject rather than a free landowner. For some families, this was acceptable. Unpleasant maybe, but survivable. You swallow your pride, pay your taxes, show up when the king calls his levies. Life goes on, but your family was different. Maybe you had backed the wrong side in the wars. Maybe you'd had a blood feud with one of Harold's allies. Maybe you just had the bad luck of owning land that some royal favourite wanted. Whatever the specific reason, the message was clear: submit completely or leave. Some people chose to fight. You know how that ended. The executions were not particularly creative, axes and ropes mostly, but they were thorough. Harold understood that leaving enemies alive was just postponing problems, so you chose to leave. You were not alone in this choice. The late 9th century saw a mass exodus from Norway, a diaspora of the dispossessed spreading across the North Atlantic. Some went to the existing Norse settlements in the British Isles, the Orkneys, Shetland, the Hebrides, the northern and eastern coasts. Of England, where the Danelaw held sway. Others pushed further to the Faroe Islands, where earlier settlers had already established communities. But by the 870s, word was spreading about somewhere new, somewhere barely touched by human settlement, somewhere with land enough for everyone: Iceland. The story of Iceland's discovery is wrapped in saga legend, which means it is probably about 30% true and 70% good storytelling. The most famous version credits a Norwegian named Ingolfur Arnason as the first permanent settler, arriving in 874 and establishing himself at Reykjavik after throwing his high seat pillars overboard and following them to shore. This was a common ritual. You let the gods guide you to your new home through the sacred wooden pillars. Very spiritual. Also a decent way to look decisive when you genuinely have no idea where to land. But there were others before Ingolfur. Nadod, a Faroese Viking who stumbled upon Iceland while blown off course, named it Snæland, Snowland, for the snow he saw on the mountains. Garda Svaveson circumnavigated the island and spent a winter there, proving it was habitable, more or less. Floki Vilgerdason tried to settle, but had a disastrous time of it. His livestock died, his party nearly starved, and he left in a bitter mood, giving the island the name that stuck: Iceland. Probably a better marketing strategy than Snowland, honestly. Sets expectations low. But despite Floki's failures, others kept coming. Because here's the thing about Iceland that outweighed all its disadvantages. It was empty. No kings, no jarls demanding fealty, no ancient blood feuds waiting to erupt, no neighbours whose great-grandfather killed your great-grandfather over a boundary dispute 3 generations ago. Iceland was a blank slate, a chance to start over, to build a new society from scratch. And the land, while harsh, was not impossible. There was grass, endless wind-rippled grass, perfect for grazing. There were fish in quantities that seemed almost obscene. Cod and herring and salmon so thick in the rivers you could practically walk across them. There were seabirds and their eggs, sea mammals for meat and oil and bone. There was geothermal heat bubbling up from the volcanic depths, hot springs where you could bathe even in winter. Naturally heated ground where things would grow that had no business growing this close to the Arctic Circle. What there was not, as you now understood with sinking certainty, was timber. The sagas mention this almost casually, like it was a minor inconvenience. Reading them from the comfort of a modern home surrounded by forests, it is easy to underestimate what this meant. But you, standing on that Icelandic shore, understood immediately. Everything you knew about building, everything your culture had developed over centuries, the great timber halls, the stave churches, the dragon-prowed longships relied on abundant wood, and you had none. The birch, forests that existed, were already being eyed by every settler. Within a few generations, those forests would be largely gone, stripped for construction and fuel, leaving Iceland as the treeless landscape it remains today. The settlers did not understand concepts like sustainable forestry. They saw trees, they needed trees, they cut trees. Simple as that. So you learned to substitute. Driftwood became precious, and the rights to collect it from specific stretches of beach became legally codified and fiercely defended. Whale bones took the place of wooden beams in some constructions. A rib cage makes a surprisingly good roof frame if you are desperate enough. Imported timber from Norway became a luxury item, available only to the wealthiest chieftains. And everyone, rich and poor alike, learned to build with turf. There is something almost organic about how this knowledge transferred. The settlers came from regions of Norway where turf construction was already known, even if it was not. The primary building method. They came from the Faroe Islands, where turf houses had been standard for generations. They brought with them slaves from Ireland and Scotland, some of whom had their own traditions of earth-sheltered construction. All of this knowledge merged and adapted, evolved to meet Iceland's specific challenges. The houses that emerged were unlike anything in mainland Scandinavia. They were lower, longer, more deeply embedded in the earth. They clustered together for warmth, multiple buildings connected by covered passages. They turned their backs to the prevailing winds, dug into south-facing slopes to capture what little solar heat the subarctic sun provided. But all of that innovation was still in the future. Right now, in these first desperate seasons, you're working with trial and error. You're learning what works and what does not. You're watching some of your neighbours' houses collapse under the weight of snow, or flood when the spring thaw comes, or simply prove too cold to survive in. You're attending funerals for people who did not figure it out fast enough, because that is the part the sagas usually skip. The failure rate, the frozen bodies, the families who bet everything on this new land and lost. You are determined not to be one of them, and so you study. You watch what the successful settlers do. You ask questions of the older immigrants, the ones who have already survived a winter or two. You learn that the angle of your roof matters, that the drainage around your foundation matters, that the type of turf you cut matters. Highland turf is different from lowland turf, marsh turf is different from meadow turf, and choosing wrong can mean the difference between a house that stands for decades and one that crumbles in the first hard rain. You learn that building a turf house is not just construction. It is an ongoing relationship with the land, a negotiation between human need and natural process that never really ends. And, slowly, season by season, you start to get it right. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before you can build anything, before you can even begin to understand the complexities of turf architecture, you need to confront the fundamental problem. Where exactly are you going to find building material on an island that seems determined to offer you nothing but grass and stone? The answer, it turns out, is right beneath your feet. The first time you really look at Iceland, really look, not just the panicked scanning for shelter or the food, it takes your breath away, and not in a good way. You grew up surrounded by trees. This is something you never thought about, never appreciated, until now. Norwegian fjords are carved through forests. The mountains are forested. The valleys are forested. Even the less fertile regions have enough woodland that you never questioned whether wood would be available for building, for burning, for tools, for ships. Wood was just there, like water, like air, a fundamental fact of existence. Iceland has no such fundamentals. You stand on a hillside and turn in a slow circle, taking in the panorama. To the east, mountains rise sharply, their peaks white with permanent snow, their slopes brown and green with grass and moss, but no trees. To the west, the land falls away toward the sea, a rumpled carpet of tundra punctuated by steam vents and hot springs, the Earth's volcanic heart bleeding heat into the cold air. South, the glacier-capped volcano that will one day be named Hekla dominates the horizon, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. North, more mountains, more grass, more absolute emptiness. And trees? You count them, you can actually count them. There, in a sheltered valley, a cluster of birches huddle together like survivors of some arboreal disaster, maybe 100 of them, if you are generous. Their tallest member might reach your shoulder. That is it, that is the forest. You remember the forests of home with a sudden, physical ache, the smell of pine resin, the sound of wind through spruce branches, the knowledge that if you needed timber, you could walk into the woods with an axe and come back with as much as you could carry. Here you could cut down every tree on the island and not have enough to build a single proper longhouse. Historians still argue about what Iceland's vegetation looked like when the settlers arrived. Some evidence suggests the birch forests were more extensive before human impact, covering perhaps 20 to 40% of the land. Others point to pollen records and suggest the forests were already sparse, limited by the harsh climate and volcanic soil. What is not debated is what happened next. Within a few centuries, the settlers had stripped the island almost bare. The birch was cut for building, for charcoal, for fuel. Sheep grazing prevented regrowth. Erosion followed deforestation, washing away the thin topsoil, leaving behind the barren landscapes that characterize much of Iceland today. But you, standing in the late 9th century, do not know any of this. You do not know that your grandchildren's grandchildren will look at an even more desolate landscape and wonder what the original settlers were thinking. You just know that you need to build shelter, you need firewood, and the trees in front of you are not going to provide either in sufficient quantity. So you start thinking differently. The grass beneath your feet is thick, lush, surprisingly deep. Iceland may lack trees, but it does not lack grass. The long summer days, the moisture-laden air, the volcanic soil, all of it conspires to create grass that grows with almost aggressive enthusiasm. It covers everything, carpeting slopes, filling valleys, growing right up to the edges of glaciers and lava fields. You kneel down and dig your fingers into the turf. The roots are dense, interlocking, forming a mat several inches thick. It is like a living fabric, the grass blades woven together by their root systems into something almost solid. You tug at it, and it resists. You pull harder, and a chunk comes free, leaving a raw wound in the earth. You hold the turf block in your hands, turning it over, examining it. It is heavy for its size, dense with moisture and organic matter. The root side is a tangle of pale fibres still clinging to bits of soil. The grass side is green and living, a miniature meadow in your palms, and something clicks in your mind. This is not a building material. It is better than a building material. It is a building material that is alive. A building material that will continue to grow after you stack it, that will knit itself together into solid walls, that will heal its own wounds and seal its own gaps if you give it time and moisture. You have found your solution. Iceland itself is going to be your shelter. The Vikings were not the first people to figure this out. Turf construction has a long history in Northern Europe, stretching back into prehistory. In the Scottish Islands, in Scandinavia, in the Faroe Islands, people had been building with turf for centuries before the Icelandic settlement. The technique was well known, if not prestigious. Back in Norway, turf houses were for the poor, for those who could not afford proper timber. They were associated with hardship and low status. In Iceland, that stigma had to disappear. There was no alternative. When everyone builds with turf, when even the wealthiest chieftains have grass growing from their roofs, the material loses its association with poverty. It becomes simply what houses are made of, and Icelandic turf, as it turned out, was particularly good for building. The volcanic soil, rich in minerals and organic matter, created a turf that was denser and stronger than the turf of other regions. The specific species of grass that thrived in Iceland had root systems optimized for binding soil together in harsh conditions. It was as if the island had spent millennia preparing itself to be built upon, evolving the perfect natural brick just in time for your arrival. Of course, the reality was messier than that clean narrative. Not all turf was created equal, and learning to identify good building turf was a skill that took years to develop. The best turf came from old, undisturbed meadows where the grass had grown for decades, building up layers of root mat. You wanted turf that was thick enough to hold together when cut, but not so thick that the blocks became impossibly heavy to lift. You wanted grass species with strong horizontal root growth, not the wispy-rooted varieties that would fall apart as soon as you tried to stack them. And then there was the question of moisture. Too dry and the turf crumbled. Too wet and it was heavy and prone to rotting. The ideal moisture content was a matter of experience, of knowing how a good block should feel in your hands, how it should sound when you tap it, how it should flex without breaking when you lift it. Some settlers never figured it out. They cut bad turf from the wrong meadows at the wrong time of year, built walls that sagged and crumbled, spent their winters in houses that leaked and froze and eventually collapsed. Learning from failure was essential, but failure in this environment could mean death. You were determined to learn from others' failures instead. And so you watch, and you ask questions, and you pay attention to the details that might seem trivial, but are actually critical. You notice that the old-timers cut their turf in the late summer, after the grass has had the whole growing season to strengthen its roots, but before the autumn rains turn the ground into soup. You notice they choose south-facing slopes where the sun has baked out some of the excess moisture. You notice they let the cut blocks sit for a day or two before stacking them, losing just enough water to reduce weight without compromising structural integrity. And you notice something else, something that strikes you as almost miraculous. The best turf cutters are not just taking grass from the land, they are taking care of the land. They cut in patterns that allow regrowth. They rotate their turf meadows like farmers rotate crops. They understand that the land is not an infinite resource, that taking too much too fast will leave them with nothing. This is sustainability before the word existed. It is the recognition that you and your descendants are going to need turf forever, that this island's your home now, that destroying it means destroying yourselves. Not everyone understands this. Some settlers cut indiscriminately, stripping meadows down to bare soil, leaving scars that take decades to heal. Some areas will never recover, the topsoil washed away by erosion, the underlying rock exposed and useless. But the communities that survive, the farmsteads that endure for centuries, are the ones that learn to work with the land rather than against it. You file this away. You will need turf for your first house. You will need more turf for repairs. You will need turf for your children's houses and their children's houses. This relationship with the land is going to last longer than your lifetime. Better get it right from the start. The sun is setting, not that it ever really sets during the Icelandic summer, just dipping toward the horizon before swinging back up, and the temperature is dropping. You have a long season of work ahead of you, months of cutting and hauling and stacking before winter makes construction impossible. Tomorrow you will start learning how to cut the living skin of the land. Tonight, you look at the grass-covered hills around you and try to see them not as a problem but as a solution, not as the absence of trees but as the presence of something else, something that will keep you alive if you can just figure out how to use it. The wind picks up, carrying the smell of salt and sulphur, and somewhere in the distance a raven calls. You think it sounds like laughter. You have spent your entire life surrounded by wood. Your cradle was wooden. Your toys were wooden. The house you grew up in was built from massive timber beams, their surfaces still showing the marks of the axes that shaped them. When you imagined building your own home someday, you imagined wood. The smell of fresh-cut pine, the satisfying weight of a beam settling into its notch, the craftsmanship of wooden joinery that your father taught you and his father taught him. That dream is dead now. It died somewhere in the middle of the North Atlantic, probably around the time you realized you were going to have to cannibalize your own ship for building materials. But in its place, something new is growing, a different kind of understanding, a recognition that Earth is not a lesser material than wood. It is simply a different material with its own strengths, its own demands, its own beauty. The old settlers call it torfbear, the turf farm, and they speak of it the way craftsmen speak of their craft. There is pride in their voices when they describe a well-built turf wall, the way the blocks interlock, the way a house settles over time into something almost geological. They show off their houses the way a shipwright shows off a new keel, pointing out the details that mark quality work. Because turf construction, you are learning, is not simple. It is not just stacking dirt and hoping for the best. It is an art form with rules and techniques refined over generations, and getting it wrong can kill you. The foundation comes first. This seems obvious. Every building needs a foundation, but in turf construction the foundation is critical in ways it is not for timber buildings. A wooden house can tolerate some shifting, some settling. The inherent flexibility of timber allows it to move without catastrophic failure. but turf walls are heavy, and they distribute that weight downward in ways that amplify any imperfection in the base. Build on unstable ground and your walls will crack. Build without proper drainage and water will seep in from below, rotting your turf from the bottom up. And build on a slope without accounting for the grade, and your entire house will slowly slide downhill, one agonizing inch at a time. So you dig. You dig down until you hit rock or hardpan, something solid enough to support the weight you are going to put on it. In Iceland, this often means digging through layers of volcanic ash and tephra, the accumulated debris of centuries of eruptions. You learn to read these layers, to understand which are stable and which are not, to recognize the dark lines of ancient ash falls that mark the passage of time like rings in a tree. Then you lay stones, a foundation of flat stones carefully selected and positioned to create a level base, a barrier between the wet earth below and the turf walls above. This is not glamorous work. It is not the kind of thing schools compose poems about, but it is essential, and doing it poorly will haunt you for as long as you live in this house. Above the stone foundation you start building walls, and here is where things get interesting. Turf construction is not monolithic. There are different techniques, different approaches, different regional variations that reflect local conditions and available materials. The method you choose depends on the quality of your turf, the shape of your site, how much stone you have access to, and frankly, how much labour you can command. The simplest approach is pure turf, blocks cut and stacked like oversized bricks, no other materials involved. This works, after a fashion. The turf blocks compress under their own weight, their root systems intertwining as they settle, creating walls that are surprisingly solid. But pure turf walls are thick, very thick. To achieve adequate structural strength and insulation, you might need walls 2 or 3 feet thick, which eats into your interior space and requires enormous quantities of material. So most builders mix turf with stone. The Icelandic variant often features a core of stones stacked dry without mortar, with turf packed around and between them. The stone provides structural strength, the turf provides insulation. The combination is stronger and more efficient than either material alone. There are also different patterns for laying the turf itself. You can lay blocks with all the grass sides facing one direction, usually outward, so the living grass protects the walls from rain. You can alternate grass side out and grass side in for better interlocking. You can cut special shapes for corners and openings, angled blocks that fit together like puzzle pieces. Historians still argue about which techniques came first, which were innovations and which were inherited traditions, how much influence came from Irish building practices versus native Scandinavian methods. The truth is probably complicated, a fusion of multiple traditions, adapted to local conditions, evolving over time, as builders learned what worked and what did not. What is not debated is the result. Icelandic turf houses, at their best, were remarkable structures, warm in winter, cool in summer, resistant to the brutal winds that would tear apart a timber building. They lasted for decades with proper maintenance, sometimes for centuries. They were proof that architecture does not require exotic materials or advanced technology, just a deep understanding of what you have available and how to use it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. You are still learning the pseu, still figuring out how to cut a proper turf block, still making mistakes that will teach you hard lessons. The tool you need is called a torfljar, a turf-cutting spade. It does not look like much. A flat iron blade attached to a wooden handle, shaped almost like a modified shovel, but in skilled hands it can cut turf blocks with surgical precision. The blade's shape is specifically designed for the task, its edge angled to slice through root mats, its flat surface sized to produce blocks of consistent dimensions. Getting one of these is not easy. Iron is precious in Iceland, as precious as timber, maybe more so. Every piece of metal was imported, either brought over on the original settlement voyages, or traded for at enormous cost with ships from Norway. A good turf spade might represent a significant portion of a family's wealth. Losing it, breaking it, having it stolen, these were genuine catastrophes. So you treat your tools with reverence, you sharpen them carefully, you store them properly, you repair them when they wear, replacing handles, reforging blades, keeping them functional for as long as possible, and you learn to use them with a kind of physical poetry. Watch an experienced turf cutter at work and you will see what I mean. The movements are economical, precise, almost rhythmic. Cut down to define the block, cut around to free it. Lever it up and out in a single smooth motion. Set it aside, step forward, repeat. A skilled cutter can produce hundreds of blocks in a day. You're not a skilled cutter. You're a beginner with blisters on your hands and a back that screams every time you bend over. Your blocks are uneven, crumbling at the edges, either too thick or too thin. You watch the experienced settlers and try to copy their technique, but something gets lost in translation. It takes time, weeks of practice before your blocks start looking respectable, months before you can work all day without collapsing, years before you can look at a meadow and know instinctively which sections will yield good turf and which should be left alone. This is knowledge that cannot be rushed. It has to be earned, block by block, blister by blister, failure by failure. And while you are learning, while your first attempts produce walls that slump and leak and generally make you question every life choice that brought you to this frozen island, you start to understand something. Earth is patient. Earth forgives. A timber joint cut wrong is ruined. You have to start over with fresh wood. But a turf block slightly misshapen can be trimmed, adjusted, worked into place. A gap in a turf wall can be stuffed with more turf. A section that is settling unevenly can be propped, adjusted, given time to find its balance. The material wants to work with you if you will let it. It wants to become a wall, a roof, a shelter. Your job is not to force it into shape, but to guide it, to understand its tendencies and work with them rather than against them. This is a different philosophy than timber construction. Timber is about precision, about joints that fit exactly, about surfaces that are flat and true. Turf is about process, about allowing things to settle and grow and change. A turf house is never really finished. It is always becoming, always adjusting, always alive. You're starting to find beauty in this. Starting to see turf construction not as the desperate compromise, but as something worth doing well. Starting to take pride in a wall that stands straight, a corner that turns cleanly, a block that fits just so. The earth is becoming your ally, and soon you are going to ask even more of it. You're going to dig into it, burrow beneath its surface, make the land itself into your shelter. But that is the next lesson. For now, focus on the blocks in front of you. Cut them clean, stack them true, learn your craft. Winter is coming, and you are not ready yet. The day you cut your first proper turf block, one that does not crumble at the edges, that holds its shape when you lift it, that looks like something you could actually build with, is the day you start to believe you might survive this. It is a small victory. The experienced settlers would laugh at your pride in a single decent block. They cut hundreds of these in a day without thinking twice. But for you, this moment represents something more than mastery of a technique. It represents hope. The turf cutting season in Iceland is mercilessly short. You can only harvest turf when the ground is not frozen and not waterlogged, a window of perhaps 4 months if you are lucky, less if the spring comes late or the autumn comes early. During this window you work. You work until your hands are raw and your back is a continuous ache and your dreams are nothing but endless fields of grass waiting to be cut. The process begins with selecting your site. Not all turf is created equal, remember. The ideal turf meadow has been undisturbed for years, allowing the grass to build up thick root mats. It faces south, getting enough sun to dry the surface without baking out all the moisture. It is on a gentle slope providing natural drainage, but not so steep that the turf slides away when you try to cut it. Finding such places is a competitive business. The best turf meadows are claimed early, often passed down within families, their locations guarded like secrets. A good meadow might supply turf for generations if managed properly. A poor choice might give you a single harvest of crumbly, useless material. You are new here. You do not have a family meadow. You are working with what you can find, what has not already been claimed by settlers who arrived before you. This means compromises. This means travelling farther than you would like, hauling turf blocks from distant hillsides, making do with material that a more established farmer would reject. But you make it work. You have to. The cutting itself follows a rhythm. You start at the edge of your chosen area, marking out a strip perhaps a foot wide. The turf aljar, your precious, irreplaceable turf spade, bites into the ground at a precise angle, slicing through the root mat with a sound like tearing cloth. You work down, then a cross, defining the boundaries of your block. The traditional Icelandic turf block, called a strenga, is roughly a foot long, 6 inches wide and 4 to 6 inches thick. These dimensions are not arbitrary. Smaller blocks would require more cutting and more handling. Larger blocks would be too heavy to lift and too difficult to fit precisely. This size represents generations of accumulated wisdom, the optimal balance of efficiency and usability. You cut the first side, then the second, then the third. The fourth side is where things get tricky. You need to slice underneath the block, separating it from the earth below without destroying the root mat that holds it together. This requires a different angle, a different technique, a kind of scooping motion that takes months to master. The first time you try this, you destroy the block. Your blade goes too deep, cutting through this root mat instead of under it, and the turf falls apart in your hands. The second time you go too shallow, and the block refuses to come free, still attached to the earth by a stubborn layer of roots you missed. The third time, somehow, impossibly, it works. The block comes up clean, a perfect rectangle of living earth, grass on top, roots on the bottom, ready to become part of a wall. You set it aside and stare at it for a long moment. Then you cut another, and another, and another. The work is brutal. Every block weighs 10 to 15 pounds, and you need thousands of them to build even a modest house. You are cutting, lifting, stacking, walking back to the cutting face, cutting again, over and over until the motion becomes automatic, till you could do it in your sleep. And you do sometimes, dreaming of endless turf fields. But you are not alone in this. Turf cutting in Iceland was never a solitary activity. It required community. Families worked together, neighbours helped neighbours, and during the intensive cutting season, the entire settlement would coordinate their efforts. This was practical. More hands meant more blocks, meant more houses finished before winter. But it was also social. The turf. Fields were places where news was shared, where marriages were arranged, where feuds were settled or started. The thralls, of course, did the heaviest work. Let us not romanticize Viking society too much. Slavery was an integral part of the economy, and enslaved people, mostly captured Irish and Scots, though some were Slavs taken from raids in the east, performed the back-breaking labour that made Icelandic settlement possible. The turf that kept free settlers warm in winter was often cut by people who had no choice in the matter, who would never own the houses their labour built. Historians still argue about the exact nature of slavery in Viking Iceland. Some evidence suggests it was relatively mild compared to other forms of slavery. Thralls could sometimes earn their freedom, could own some property, had certain legal protections. Other evidence paints a grimmer picture. People treated as property, worked to death, subject to casual violence. The truth probably varied depending on the owner, the circumstances, the specific time period. What is not debated is that the great turf houses of Iceland were built in significant part by people whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told, who made survival possible for others and received nothing in return. This is worth remembering as you admire the architecture. Every block has a history. Not all of those histories are heroic. But back to the cutting. You have your blocks, let us say a few dozen after your first day of real work, and now you need to move them. This is where things get logistically complicated. Turf is heavy, and it does not get lighter the farther you carry it. The lucky settlers had horses. Iceland was home to a unique breed, small, sturdy, adapted to the local conditions, and these horses could be fitted with pack saddles and loaded with turf blocks. A good horse could carry maybe 10 blocks at a time, making multiple trips between the turf meadow and the building site. You do not have a horse. Not yet. Maybe not ever if things go badly. So you carry the blocks yourself, 2 at a time, balanced on a wooden frame strapped to your back. The frame is called a cliffberry, a pack saddle frame adapted for human use, and wearing it makes you feel like a beast of burden, which you essentially are. The path from the turf meadow to your building site is maybe half a mile there, half a mile back. With 2 blocks per trip, you're looking at 500 trips just to move 1,000 blocks. And 1,000 blocks is barely enough for a small outbuilding, nowhere near enough for a proper house. You do the math in your head and feel despair settling in. At this rate, you'll be hauling turf until you're an old man, and you will never finish your house, and you will freeze to death in some temporary shelter while your neatly stacked turf blocks wait uselessly nearby. Then you remember something one of the old settlers said. Work smarter, not harder. You start looking for a building site closer to good turf. You find a south-facing slope with a thick meadow right on top, cut the turf, and you are already at your building site. The blocks do not need to be carried anywhere. They just need to be moved a few feet and stacked. This is obvious in retrospect. So obvious you want to slap yourself for not thinking of it immediately. But the learning process is like that. Full of moments where the solution was right in front of you the whole time, invisible until suddenly it is not. Your new site is not perfect. It is further from the stream than you would like, and the ground is rocky in places, and the wind comes howling down from the north with nothing to block it. But the turf is right there, dense and perfect. A meadow that has been growing undisturbed for centuries, waiting for you. You dig in, literally. The turf comes up clean. Block after block, faster now that you have some practice, a growing pile of building material, accumulating next to your foundation. Somewhere in the distance, a gull screams. The sun is low on the horizon. It is always low on the horizon in Iceland, even in summer, casting long shadows across the grass. You're going to build a house here. Not just any house. A house that burrows into this hillside, that uses the earth itself as insulation and protection. You're going to disappear into the landscape, and maybe, just maybe, you are going to survive. There is a moment, partway through digging into the hillside, when you understand why your ancestors spoke of the dwarves as master builders. The Norse myths are full of beings who live underground, who carve their homes from the living rock, who know secrets about earth and stone that surface dwellers can never comprehend. Standing in your half-excavated pit, surrounded by walls of dirt and roots and ancient volcanic ash, you start to feel like you are joining their ranks. You are not building on the land, you are building into it. And that makes all the difference. The decision to dig semi-subterranean was not aesthetic. It was not some philosophical statement about humanity's relationship with nature. It was pure, cold-blooded thermodynamics. Underground construction offered advantages that surface buildings simply could not match, and in a climate as brutal as Iceland's, those advantages meant the difference between life and death. Let us talk about temperature for a moment. The Icelandic winter is not merely cold, it is aggressive. Temperatures plunge well below freezing for months at a time. Winds howl across the treeless landscape at speeds that would make a hurricane envious. Snow falls sideways, piling up in drifts that can bury a house, filling every crack and gap with icy powder. A surface building takes the full brunt of this assault. Wind steals heat from its walls, cold penetrates from every direction, top, bottom, sides. The temperature differential between inside and outside might be 50 C or 60 degrees, and maintaining that differential requires constant effort, constant fuel, constant vigilance. Now consider a building dug into a hillside. The earth itself becomes insulation. The ground beneath your feet maintains a relatively stable temperature year-round, hovering somewhere around 40-50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the surface is frozen solid. This is called the thermal mass effect, and it is one of nature's great gifts to underground builders. By digging down and back into a slope, you are surrounding your living space with material that is warmer than the winter air above ground. The math is dramatically in your favour. A semi-subterranean house might only need to heat the difference between 45 degrees and 65 degrees, a 20-degree lift, while a surface house needs to heat the difference between 10 degrees and 65 degrees, a 55-degree lift. That is less than half the heating requirement, less fuel consumed, less smoke inhaled, less firewood gathered, more survival margin, and it gets better. Earth is an excellent insulator, not just because of its temperature stability, but because of the way it resists heat transfer. The air pockets in soil, the irregular structure of root systems and decomposed organic matter, all of this creates a complex barrier that slows the movements of thermal energy. A well-built turf wall can match the insulation value of a modern fiberglass insulated wall, and the Vikings achieved this using nothing but grass and dirt. But digging into a hillside is not simply a matter of grabbing a shovel and going at it. The site selection is critical. You need a slope, preferably south-facing, to capture maximum solar gain during the short winter days. You need stable soil that will not collapse on you. You need natural drainage so groundwater does not seep in and turn your house into a perpetual swamp. The slope orientation matters more than you might think. In Iceland, the sun never rises very high in the sky, even at midsummer. During winter, it barely clears the horizon, hugging the southern sky in a low, pale arc before dipping back below. By facing your house south, you allow what little sunlight exists to penetrate through your doorway, warming the interior directly. It is passive solar heating, Viking style. The digging process follows a pattern that has been refined over generations. You start by removing the turf from your chosen area, cutting it carefully and setting it aside. This is prime building material and you do not want to waste it. Then you dig down and back, excavating the soil in stages, creating a pit that will become your floor and the lower portions of your walls. How deep to dig is a matter of judgment. Too shallow, and you lose the thermal advantages that made underground construction worthwhile. Too deep and you risk hitting groundwater, create drainage problems, and make entering and exiting your house unnecessarily difficult. Most Icelandic turf houses were dug, perhaps 3 to 4 feet into the ground, enough to gain significant thermal mass without the complications of deeper excavation. As you dig, you begin shaping the space. The traditional Icelandic longhouse was not a simple rectangle. It was a carefully designed floor plan with distinct zones for different activities. The entrance corridor, called the bur, was often the lowest point, sloping down from the outside to the main living space. This served multiple purposes. It created an airlock that reduced heat loss when the door was opened, it provided space for storage, and it offered a psychological transition from the outside world to the domestic interior. Beyond the entrance corridor lay the skali, the main hall. This was the heart of the house, the space where cooking and eating and working and sleeping all happened. The floor here was typically raised above the entrance corridor, sitting perhaps a foot or two higher, which helped keep the living space dry and created a subtle sense of arrival as you stepped up into the warmth. And the walls were a hybrid construction, part excavation and part built-up turf. The rear wall and lower portions of the side walls were often just the earth you had dug into, faced with stone or lined with additional turf for moisture control. The upper portions of the walls, and the front wall facing the open air, were built up from turf blocks, rising from the excavated pit to merge with the roof above. Historians still argue about how much regional variation existed in these floor plans. Some evidence suggests strong local traditions, with clusters of houses in the same area sharing similar layouts. Other evidence points to significant variation even within single farmsteads, as builders experimented with different arrangements. The truth is probably that certain principles were universal: the sunken entrance, the raised living space, the south-facing orientation, while the details varied based on individual preference, available materials and local conditions. What is clear is that these houses were not primitive shelters thrown together by desperate refugees. They were sophisticated structures designed by people who understood their environment intimately, who had developed solutions to specific problems through generations of trial and error. You are standing in a hole you have dug into an Icelandic hillside, and you are inheriting all of that accumulated wisdom. The shape you are creating is not arbitrary. It is the result of centuries of refinement. The way you orient toward the sun and the depth you dig, the angles of your walls, all of this has been figured out before you, by people who did not have thermometers or equations, but who understood heat and cold in their bones. The excavation is exhausting work. The soil in Iceland is often rocky, studded with volcanic stones that need to be pried loose and hauled away. The deeper you dig, the more groundwater becomes a concern, seepage, from the hillside above, from the volcanic substrate below. You learn to dig drainage channels to line the bottom of your pit with stones that allow water to flow away rather than pooling. And as you dig, you discover things. A layer of ash from an eruption that happened before you were born, before your father was born, a dark stripe in the earth that marks some ancient catastrophe. Animal bones, the remains of meals eaten by people or animals long before the Norse arrived, perhaps from the Irish monks who were here briefly, perhaps from earlier, unknown visitors. A stone that looks worked, shaped by hands, though you cannot imagine who would have been here to shape it. The land has stories. Digging into it means encountering those stories, becoming part of them. By the time your excavation is complete, you have created a space that feels less like a construction project and more like a natural feature of the landscape. The walls curve slightly inward. The floor follows the contours of the underlying rock. There are niches and irregularities that you did not plan but that seem right somehow, as if the earth itself had opinions about how your house should be shaped. Tomorrow you will start building up, laying the turf walls that will rise from this pit, closing in the space, creating something that is not quite cave and not quite house, but something uniquely Icelandic, something in between. You rest your hand against the cool earth of the excavated wall. It feels solid, permanent, ancient. You are becoming part of the land, and the land is becoming part of you. You wake in the half-finished house for the first time, and for a moment you do not know where you are. The walls are earth, the ceiling is earth, the smell is earth, rich, mineral, alive. Then memory returns, and with it, a small incredulous pride. You built this, not finished yet, not even close, but the structure is taking shape. The excavation is complete. The lower walls are in place. Packed earth on the hillside end, turf blocks rising from the foundation at the open end. A temporary covering of sailcloth keeps out the worst of the weather. It is not warm, not really, but it is warmer than sleeping under the stars. Today you work on the interior. The traditional Icelandic longhouse was not a single open space. It was divided, organised, designed with specific areas for specific activities. Understanding this layout is essential to understanding how these houses worked, how they transformed a hole in the ground into something that could sustain human life through months of darkness. The central feature, literally and figuratively, was the long hearth. Called the Langaldur, it ran down the middle of the main living space. A rectangular fire pit perhaps 3 feet wide and 10 or 15 feet long. This was not a cosy fireplace for occasional use. This was the lifeblood of the house, burning continuously from autumn to spring, the source of heat and light. And cooking and frankly sanity. You have been collecting fuel since you arrived. Driftwood, mostly, hauled from the beaches where ocean currents deposit timber from distant forests, dried dung from sheep and cattle, which burns hot and clean once you get past the initial psychological barrier. Peat from the bogs, cut and dried and stacked in endless rows. Bone and fat from marine mammals, which provide intense heat but produce greasy, unpleasant smoke. The fire is positioned carefully. Too close to the walls and you risk setting the house ablaze. Turf does not burn easily, but once it gets going it smoulders forever. Too far from the walls and you waste heat that should be warming the living space. The traditional placement right down the centre of the hall reflects generations of optimization. Along both sides of the long hearth run raised platforms called set. These are the benches where you sit, work, eat and sleep. They rise perhaps a foot above the floor level, which accomplishes several things. It keeps sleepers above the coldest air, which settles near the ground. It creates storage space beneath the platforms. It provides a comfortable working height for tasks like spinning, weaving and leatherworking. The platforms are built from whatever materials are available. A lucky builder might have enough driftwood to create proper wooden planking. Most make do with packed earth covered with stone slabs, with straw or animal hides laid on top for insulation and comfort. The idea is to create a surface that is level, relatively soft, and elevated enough to escape the ground level chill. At one end of the hall, traditionally the end opposite the entrance, sits the place of honour. This is where the master of the house sits, where important guests are received, where the high seat pillars stand if you are fortunate enough to bring them from home. The floor here might be slightly raised, the platform slightly wider. This is where decisions are made, where disputes are settled, where the formal business of the household occurs. At the opposite end, near the entrance, the functions become more practical and less prestigious. This is where food is stored, where tools are kept, where the daily work of survival happens. The transition from the entrance to the high seat end traces a journey from the mundane to the sacred, from the outside world to the heart of the home. And then there are the animals. Historians still argue about exactly how Viking-era Icelanders organised their livestock housing. Some evidence suggests that animals were kept in separate buildings, connected to the main house by covered passages. Other evidence, including excavations of some of the earliest Icelandic farmsteads, indicates that animals lived directly within the main longhouse, separated from the human living space by nothing more than a partition or a change in floor level. This sounds horrifying by the modern standards. Sharing your living space with cows, sheep, horses, the smell, the noise, the general medieval lack of hygiene. But consider the advantages. Every animal is a furnace, radiating heat constantly. A single cow produces roughly the same amount of heat as a small space heater. A dozen animals together can raise the temperature of an enclosed space by 10 or 15 degrees. In a climate where every degree matters, where fuel is scarce and heat is survival, those animal furnaces were not a burden to be tolerated but a resource to be cultivated. The arrangement was practical. The animal section, called the fios, was typically at the lowest end of the house near the entrance. This allowed drainage, because animals produce a lot of liquid waste, to flow away from the human living space and eventually out of the building. The humans lived at the higher end, where the air was better and the floor was drier. The heat from the animals rose and drifted toward the human end. The smell inevitably followed. But in a house, where the fire burned constantly and ventilation was minimal, a certain baseline of smoky, animal-scented air was simply accepted as normal. Your standards for indoor air quality were about to be radically recalibrated. Between the human space and the animal space, there was often a partition, sometimes just a low wall of turf or stone, sometimes a more substantial barrier with a door. This served to contain the animals when needed, to create a psychological boundary between human and beast, and to reduce some of the draft that would otherwise flow from the entrance through the animal section and into the living space. You start building these partitions now, laying stones for the base, stacking turf blocks to create walls perhaps 4 feet high, leaving gaps for doors, which will be precious wooden frames filled with whatever you can manage, planks if you have them, woven withies if you do not. The work is slow but satisfying. Each day the interior takes shape a little more, but platforms rise along the walls, the hearth pit is dug and lined with flat stones. The partition separating human from animal space achieves some semblance of completion, and you start thinking about light. The Icelandic winter is dark, not just short day dark, but genuinely, oppressively, maddeningly dark. For months the sun barely clears the horizon, casting a pale, cold light for a few hours before disappearing again. The rest of the time, it is night. In a turf house, windows are problematic. Glass is essentially unavailable, a luxury import that only the wealthiest could afford, and then only for small pieces. Openings in the walls or roof let in light, but they also let in cold, rain, snow and wind. The solution most Icelandic settlers adopted was to minimise openings, relying on the fire for light and accepting that winter meant darkness. Some houses incorporated sky windows, small openings in the roof covered with translucent material. Stretched animal membranes were common, the bladders or stomachs of seals or cattle scraped thin enough to allow some light through, while blocking the worst of the weather. These were not effective by modern standards, but they were better than nothing, providing a dim, diffuse illumination that at least reminded inhabitants that the sun still existed somewhere. The psychological impact of this darkness is hard to overstate. Seasonal affective disorder was not a concept the Vikings would have recognised, but they certainly experienced its effects. The winter months were associated with gloom, with depression, with the tendency for quarrels to escalate and tempers to fray. The sagas are full of feuds that started with minor insults during the dark months, when people had been cooped up together too long and the endless night weighed on everyone's spirits. This is why the fire mattered so much. Not just for heat, not just for cooking, but for the simple, essential presence of light in the darkness. The flames dancing. In the long hearth were the heart of the household in more than a metaphorical sense. They were the visual focus that held the community together, the flickering brightness that kept the dark at bay. You will spend countless hours staring at that fire over the coming months, watching the flames, listening to the crackle and hiss, letting your mind drift into the patterns of light and shadow. But that is later. For now, the hearth is just a pit lined with stones. The platforms are incomplete. The partitions are half built. The roof is still a question mark. Outside, the wind is picking up. Autumn is arriving fast, and you are not ready. You get back to work. Let us talk about the elephant in the room, or more accurately, the cow, and the sheep, and the goats, and the horses, and any other livestock you manage to bring to this frozen rock. They are going to live with you. In your house, right there, a few feet from where you sleep. This sounds unsanitary because it absolutely is. Unsanitary. By modern standards, sharing your living space with livestock is somewhere between inadvisable and a violation of multiple health codes. The diseases, the parasites, the smell, the noise, the constant production of waste that has to go somewhere. But you are not living by the modern standards. You are living in 9th century Iceland, and by 9th century Icelandic standards, keeping animals inside is one of the smartest things you can do. Start with the obvious. Warmth. We touched on this before, but it is worth emphasising. Each animal in your byre is a biological furnace converting hay and grass into heat. A healthy cow produces somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 BTUs per hour, roughly equivalent to a small space heater. but one that runs on grass and produces fertilizer as a byproduct. In an Icelandic winter, where temperatures can plunge to -20 or colder, where fuel is always in short supply, where keeping the central fire burning is a constant struggle, animal heat is not trivial, it is essential. A house with a dozen cows in the byre might be 15 or 20 degrees warmer than an identical house without animals. Those degrees can be the difference between survivable discomfort and freezing to death. The arrangement also allows you to care for your animals more easily. During the worst winter storms, when going outside means risking your life, you can still feed and water your livestock, you can monitor their health, you can protect them from predators, Arctic foxes, primarily, though in later centuries the occasional polar bear would wander over from Greenland on drift ice and cause problems, and your animals protect you. Not in a physical sense, a cow is not going to fight off attackers, but in an economic sense. Your livestock represent your wealth, your food security, your future. Keeping them inside under your direct supervision reduces the risk of theft, predation, and loss to weather. But the intimacy of this arrangement goes beyond practicality. Living with the animals changes your relationship with them. You learn their personalities. This sheep is pushy, that one is timid. You notice immediately when something is wrong. A cow off her feed, a horse favouring one leg. You develop a kind of connection that is harder to maintain when animals are housed separately at a distance. Historians still argue about the emotional dimensions of this relationship. Some scholars see Viking livestock keeping as purely instrumental, animals as resources, nothing more. Others point to evidence of genuine affection, horses buried with their owners, grieving recorded in sagas when favourite animals died, names given to individual beasts. The truth is probably that human-animal relationships in Viking Iceland were as complex and varied as human-animal relationships anywhere. Some people loved their animals, some saw them as tools. Most probably felt something in between, a practical affection that acknowledged both the emotional bond and the eventual plate of mutton stew. What is clear is that the design of the turf house facilitated this close relationship. The effios, the animal quarters, was not an afterthought or a separate structure grudgingly attached. It was an integral part of the house design, planned from the beginning, its placement and construction as carefully considered as the human living space. The typical arrangement placed the fios at the lower end of the house near the entrance. This allowed animal waste to drain downward and outward, away from the human living space. A channel in the floor, sometimes lined with flat stones, carried liquid waste toward a collecting pit or out through a drainage hole in the wall. The animals themselves stood in stalls along the walls, their heads toward the centre, their rumps toward the outer walls where the drainage channels ran. Cows were tied to posts or rings. Sheep and goats were often kept in communal pens rather than individual stalls. Horses, being more valuable and more likely to cause trouble if confined too tightly, might have slightly larger individual spaces. Between the animal stalls and the human living area, there was usually some kind of partition. Sometimes this was a proper wall of turf and stone. Sometimes it was just a low barrier, more symbolic than physical. The division acknowledged that while humans and animals shared the same structure, they occupied different zones within it. But smell does not respect zones, neither does sound. Living with livestock meant living with their constant presence, the low breathing, the shifting and stamping, the occasional distressed bellow, or agitated bleat. At night, when the human fire burned low and darkness settled over everything, the sounds of the animals were a kind of comfort. You were not alone in the dark. Other living things surrounded you, warm and breathing and alive. This is something that gets lost when we think about historical living. Conditions as simply primitive or uncomfortable. Yes, sharing your house with cows was unhygienic by the modern standards. Yes, it contributed to disease transmission. Yes, it smelled terrible. But it also meant never being alone, never facing the long winter darkness in isolation. The animals were companions as well as resources, their presence a hedge against the particular kind of madness that isolation can bring. The women of the household especially would have spent significant time in and around the animal quarters. Milking was done twice daily throughout the winter. Iceland's dairy tradition is ancient and deeply rooted. This meant kneeling in the fjords, hands on udders, face near the warm flank of a cow, while the rest of the household slept or worked at other tasks. The milk went into making skyr, the yogurt-like dairy product that is still an Icelandic specialty. It went into butter, into cheese, into a dozen other preserved forms that would keep through the lean months. The making of these products was women's work, carried out in the semi-darkness of the turf house by firelight and animal warmth. You're trying not to think too much about the sanitation implications of making dairy products a few feet from where animals are producing manure. The Vikings had not developed germ theory. They did not understand the connections between hygiene and disease. They did what worked, what had always worked. And if sometimes people got sick or children died, well, that was just how life was. The mortality rates in Viking-era Iceland were not good. Infant mortality was high. Infectious disease took a regular toll. The living conditions inside the turf houses, the smoke, the animals, the crowding, the poor ventilation, contributed to these numbers. But people survived. Populations grew, the settlement succeeded. The house you are building will have space for animals. It has to. You're planning for 5 or 6 cattle, a dozen sheep, maybe a few goats. Their body heat will be essential. Their milk will be essential. Their wool and hides and eventual meat will be essential. They are not just livestock, they are survival partners. Tomorrow you will work on expanding the FYOS section, building out the stalls, digging the drainage channels, making sure there is space for the hay that will feed these animals through the long winter. For now, you settle onto your half-finished sleeping platform and listen to the wind outside. Somewhere in the distance, one of your sheep is calling, a lonely, plaintive sound that echoes across the treeless landscape. Soon that sheep will be inside, warm, safe, annoying probably, at 3 a.m. when it decides to vocalize for no apparent reason, but alive, just like you. The smoke is the first thing that hits you. Before your eyes adjust to the dimness, before you take in the arrangement of platforms and hearth and stored goods, the smoke is there, thick and acrid and unavoidable. It coils around everything, filling the upper reaches of the space, seeping into your clothing, your hair, your lungs. Welcome to life in a turf house. The ventilation problem was never solved, not really, not in the entire 1,000-year history of Icelandic turf construction. Fire requires oxygen. Fire produces smoke. In an enclosed space designed to trap heat, there is a fundamental tension between keeping warm and being able to breathe. The Vikings tried various solutions, none of them entirely satisfactory. The simplest approach was the smoke hole, an opening in the roof positioned above the central hearth, allowing smoke to escape vertically. This works, after a fashion. Hot air rises, carrying smoke with it, creating a natural draft that pulls foul air out and draws fresh air in through this door and other small openings. But a smoke hole is also a heat hole. All that rising warm air does not just carry smoke, it carries the heat you worked so hard to generate. A generous smoke hole can lose more heat than the fire produces, defeating the entire purpose of building a house in the first place. And during rain or snow, a smoke hole admits water, dripping onto the hearth, potentially extinguishing the fire, certainly making a mess. So smoke holes in Icelandic turf houses tended to be small. Too small, really. Enough to let some smoke escape, but not enough to prevent the constant haze that characterized indoor air. The result was chronic smoke exposure for everyone who lived in these homes, with predictable health consequences. The study of bones from Viking-era Icelandic burials reveals what you might expect. Widespread evidence of respiratory disease, sinusitis, chronic bronchitis, emphysema-like changes in lung tissue. The people who survived Icelandic winters did so with damaged lungs, their respiratory systems marked by years of breathing smoky air. And it wasn't just respiratory disease. The compounds in wood smoke include carcinogens, the soot that coated every surface, contained toxic substances. Eye irritation was constant and long-term eye damage was common. The chroniclers of later periods often remarked on the poor eyesight of rural Icelanders, attributing it variously to the darkness, the smoke, or some inherent weakness of the population. We now understand that it was probably the smoke, decades of exposure damaging the delicate tissues of the cornea and conjunctiva. But you cannot live without fire. Fire is heat. Fire is light. Fire is cooking, which is essential because eating raw food in Iceland is a good way to contract parasites and digestive diseases. So you learn to live with smoke, to minimize it where possible, to accept what cannot be eliminated. There are tricks. Dry fuel burns cleaner than wet fuel, obvious in retrospect, but not everyone figures it out immediately. Properly seasoned driftwood produces less smoke than green wood or damp driftwood. Dried animal dung, despite its unpleasant associations, actually burns quite cleanly once you get it started. The timing of your fire matters too. During the day, when you need to see and work, you keep the fire higher, accepting more smoke in exchange for more light. At night, when the household is sleeping, you bank the fire low, reducing smoke production, relying on the retained heat in the turf walls and the body heat of humans and animals to maintain tolerable temperatures. The design of the hearth helps. A properly constructed long hearth spreads the fire out rather than concentrating it, reducing the intensity of any single point while maintaining overall heat output. The flat stones lining the hearth absorb heat during active burning and radiate it back slowly as the fire dies down, smoothing out the temperature fluctuations. Some houses experimented with more elaborate smoke management. There are archaeological traces of houses with divided spaces, fire rooms separated from living rooms by internal walls. The fire would burn in one space, its heat radiating through the wall into the adjacent living area, while the smoke was vented directly outside. This is basically a primitive version of a central heating system, and it worked reasonably well, but it required more construction and more careful design than most settlers could manage. There is also evidence of what might be called acceptance technology, things people did not to reduce smoke but to cope with its presence. Hanging herbs from the rafters, which might have helped mask the smell. Positioning sleeping platforms low on the walls where the air was somewhat clearer. Spending as much time as possible outdoors during the summer months, giving respiratory systems a chance to recover. Historians still argue about how aware Viking-era Icelanders were of the health effects of their smoky homes. Some suggest they were completely ignorant, that the connection between smoke exposure and disease was not made until much later. Others point to evidence that people understood at least some of the risks, references to sick houses with particularly bad air, accounts of people developing chronic coughs after moving into poorly ventilated dwellings. The truth is probably somewhere in between. They knew smoke was unpleasant. They knew heavy exposure made people cough and wheeze. They probably understood that some houses were worse than others, but without germ theory, without the ability to see microscopic damage to lung tissue, without controlled experiments comparing outcomes, they could not have understood the full scope of the problem. And even if they had understood, what could they have done? The alternatives were freezing or starving. Smoke exposure was the price of survival, a trade-off accepted because there was no real choice. You're becoming intimately familiar with this trade-off. Your eyes water constantly, your throat is raw. In the mornings, you cough up dark phlegm, your lungs trying to expel the particles they've accumulated overnight. This is just how it is now. This is your life. But you are alive. The house is holding. The first serious cold snaps have come and gone, and the temperature inside stayed above freezing. The turf walls are doing their job. The combination of fire heat and animal heat and earth insulation is working. The smoke is the cost. You pay it willingly, and slowly you start to not notice it as much. Your body adapts. Not in a healthy way probably, but in a functional way. The constant irritation becomes background noise. The haze in the upper air becomes normal, unremarkable, just another feature of indoor living. Visitors from outside, the rare stranger who passes through, always comment on the smoke. Their eyes stream, they cough. They ask how you can stand it. You have forgotten that it's something to stand. It is simply how air is inside. This is the most insidious thing about chronic conditions, not the immediate discomfort, but the normalization. The way the abnormal becomes ordinary, the way suffering becomes invisible because it never stops. You will spend decades in this house, breathing this air. The damage will accumulate silently, invisibly, showing up only in middle age when the coughing gets worse and the breathing gets harder. And the cold air of winter hurts in ways it never used to. But that's a long way off. For now, you have a roof over your head. You have fire, you have smoke, you have survival. The rest is just details. Let us talk about why you are not frozen solid. You are huddled in a structure made largely of grass and dirt, on an island closer to the Arctic Circle than most of humanity would ever dream of settling, in the middle of a winter that has already killed some of your less prepared neighbours. The wind outside is screaming. The temperature, if you had a thermometer to measure it, would register somewhere in the single digits or below. Snow has buried the landscape, turning everything into a uniform white that makes navigation nearly impossible and makes the hours between rare glimpses of the pale winter sun stretch into an eternal darkness. And yet you are not dead. You are cold, certainly. Cold is your constant companion, but you are not hypothermic. You are not losing fingers and toes to frostbite. You are not succumbing to the creeping numbness that precedes death by exposure. This is not luck. This is physics. The turf walls that surround you are performing a kind of thermal magic. To understand what they are doing, you need to understand a few concepts that the Vikings knew intuitively, even if they could not have articulated them. Thermal mass, insulation, and air infiltration. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb and store heat. Dense materials with high heat capacity, stone, earth, water, can absorb large amounts of thermal energy without their temperature changing much. They act like batteries for heat, charging up during warm periods and discharging during cold ones. The earth surrounding your turf house has enormous thermal mass. All those cubic meters of soil, all that weight of compacted earth can absorb tremendous amounts of heat energy. When you build a fire, some of that heat radiates into the walls. The walls absorb it, their temperature rising slowly, storing the energy for later. When the fire burns low, the walls begin to radiate that stored heat back into the living space, smoothing out the temperature swings that would otherwise make life impossible. But thermal mass alone is not enough. You also need insulation, the ability to resist heat transfer. A material can have great thermal mass but poor insulation. Think of a slab of metal. It stores heat well, but also loses it quickly. What makes turf special is that it has both. The insulating properties of turf come from its structure. Air is an excellent insulator, and turf is full of air. In the soil pores, in the root matrix, in the tiny gaps between particles. These air pockets interrupt the flow of heat, slowing conduction to a crawl. The denser the turf, the more thermal mass. But the root structure also creates channels of trapped air that provide insulation. It is a balance. The Vikings figured out by trial and error what modern engineers would quantify: the optimal density and thickness for turf walls that maximize both heat storage and heat retention. Walls 2 to 3 feet thick, built from well-rooted turf, provide insulation values comparable to modern insulated construction. Add to this the semi-subterranean design. The earth surrounding the lower portions of your house maintains a stable temperature year-round, somewhere around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the surface air is below zero. By digging into this earth, you are essentially tapping into a thermal reservoir. The ground is not warm exactly, but it is warmer than the air, and that differential matters. The third factor is air infiltration, or rather, the lack of it. A drafty house loses heat not through the walls, but through the gaps where air can flow. Every crack, every poorly sealed opening, every space where wind can penetrate represents a pathway for heat to escape. Turf construction is naturally good at minimizing infiltration. The blocks are soft and flexible, molding to each other as they settle. Gaps fill naturally with soil and root growth. The living grass on the roof continues to grow, knitting together into a continuous mat that sheds water and blocks wind. Unlike a wooden structure, which dries and shrinks and opens gaps over time, a turf structure actually seals itself better as it ages. There is a quirky bit of knowledge that modern engineers have rediscovered. Living roofs have superior thermal performance partly because of evapotranspiration. When grass grows on your roof, it releases water vapor into the air. This evaporative cooling is beneficial in summer, reducing heat gain. In winter, the grass goes dormant, but the insulating layer of dead vegetation remains, creating additional protection. Historians still argue about how much the Vikings understood these principles. Some scholars suggest they had an intuitive grasp of thermodynamics honed by generations of experience. Others argue that the designs evolved through pure trial and error, with successful innovations spreading and unsuccessful ones killing their creators. Either way, the result is a structure that works astonishingly well. Studies of reconstructed turf houses show that they can maintain interior temperatures 30 to 40 degrees warmer than exterior temperatures with relatively modest heating. A small fire burning continuously can keep a well-built turf house at livable temperatures through the worst of an Icelandic winter. And you are experiencing this firsthand. The fire crackles in the long hearth. The smoke rises and disperses into the darkness above. Your face is warm, almost hot, while your back, the side facing the outer wall, is cooler but not cold. The temperature, gradient across the room, is noticeable but tolerable. You pull your wool cloak tighter and shift position, presenting a different side to the fire. Rotation is key to staying comfortable when your heat source is radiant rather than convective. You learn to turn regularly, like meat on a spit, warming one side while the other cools. The animals at the far end of the house add their contribution. You can feel the difference on nights when they are restless versus nights when they are calm. Active animals generate more heat. Sleeping animals generate less but are also quiet, allowing you to sleep. Your sleeping arrangements reflect the thermal realities of the house. The platforms along the walls are positioned to catch heat from the fire without being directly in the smoke path. The sleeping spaces are communal, multiple bodies sharing blankets and body heat. Privacy is a luxury that cold climates cannot afford. You learned early on that the coldest part of the house is the floor. Cold, air sinks, pooling at the lowest level, creating a frigid layer that can be several degrees colder than the air at head height. The raised platforms are not just about creating storage space beneath them. They lift sleepers out of this cold pool into the warmer air above. The warmest spot is directly beside the fire, but that spot is also the smokiest and most likely to result in burns. The optimal position is a few feet back, close enough to catch radiant heat, far enough to avoid immediate danger. This prime real estate is allocated by social hierarchy. The house's master and mistress get the best spots, children and servants get the less desirable ones. As you settle in for another long winter night, you think about how strange your life has become. A year ago, you were in Norway, in a wooden house, in a landscape covered with forests. Now you live in a hole in the ground, surrounded by grass and dirt, sharing your space with livestock, breathing smoke, measuring wealth in driftwood and dried fish. But you are warm. Not comfortable, but warm enough. The turf walls that seemed so primitive when you started building them have proven themselves. The earth that resisted your shovel now embraces you, holds you, keeps you alive. Outside the wind howls, inside the fire crackles. The animals shift and breathe. Your family sleeps, their bodies warm against yours. You're going to make it through this winter. You close your eyes and let the darkness take you. There is another reason you built your house half underground and covered it with grass. A reason nobody talks about much, but everyone knows. It makes you invisible. Stand on a hilltop on the Icelandic coast and look inland. What do you see? Grass, hills, more grass, steam rising from hot springs, the occasional sheep grazing, perhaps a distant glacier white against the grey sky. What you do not see, what you're not supposed to see, are the farmsteads. The houses blend so perfectly into the landscape that you could walk within 100 metres of one and miss it entirely. The grass-covered roofs look like natural hillocks. The earth walls merge seamlessly into the surrounding terrain. Only the thin thread of smoke rising from somewhere in the grass gives away the presence of human habitation, and even that disperses quickly in the constant Icelandic wind. This is not an accident. The Vikings were not stupid. They knew that a visible house was a vulnerable house. They had left Norway because of political violence. They had sailed through waters where pirates and raiders operated. They had arrived at an island that might attract hostile visitors at any time. The history of the Norse world was written in blood, in burned farms and stolen cattle, and enslaved captives. Visibility meant vulnerability, so they disappeared. The semi-subterranean design that provided such excellent thermal performance also provided excellent camouflage. A house built on the surface, even a turf house, would present a visible profile, walls rising against the sky, a distinctive shape that marks human presence. But a house dug into a hillside, its roof continuous with the surrounding grass, presents no profile at all. It is not a house on the landscape, it is part of the landscape. Approaching from the sea, the most likely direction for any hostile force, these homesteads were essentially invisible. A Viking ship, even if its crew knew approximately where a settlement was located, would have difficulty identifying specific targets from the water. The raiders who had terrorized the coasts of Britain and France found their techniques less effective against an enemy who had borrowed their own playbook and improved upon it. This is one of history's little ironies. The Vikings, masters of coastal raiding, built homes specifically designed to foil coastal raiders. The same people who had appeared seemingly from nowhere to attack monasteries and villages now lived in houses that seemed to appear from nowhere, materializing out of the grass only when you were almost on top of them. Historians still argue about how much the defensive properties of turf houses influenced their design versus how much the design was driven by thermal necessities. The honest answer is probably both, and we cannot disentangle them. The same features that made these houses warm also made them hidden. The same decisions that conserved heat also concealed presence. But there are some details that seem harder to explain purely through thermal logic. The entrance corridors, for instance, were often positioned to face away from the most likely approach directions, inland rather than toward the sea, or angled so that a visitor could not see directly into the main hall from outside. This is not thermally optimal. An entrance facing the sun would provide more passive solar heating, but it is defensively sound. The clustering of buildings too seems to have defensive implications. A single or isolated house is vulnerable. A group of houses, connected by covered passages, allows inhabitants to move between structures without exposing themselves. Women and children can flee to one building while men defend another. Resources can be consolidated or dispersed depending on the threat. There are saga accounts of farmsteads being attacked, and the defenders using the architecture to their advantage. Blocking entrance corridors with obstacles, using the low doorways to force attackers to enter one at a time, bent over and vulnerable. Taking advantage of defenders' familiarity with the dark interior, while attackers stumbled blind. A turf house was not a fortress. It could be burned if attackers were willing to pile enough fuel on the roof. It could be besieged if attackers had time and patience. But against the kind of quick, violent raids that characterized much of Viking-era conflict, the design offered real advantages. The camouflage reduced the chance of being targeted in the first place. The architecture slowed and confused attackers if they did arrive. There is something deeper here too, something psychological. Living in a house that is part of the earth, invisible from a distance, tucked into the landscape like a hibernating animal, does something to your sense of self. You start to feel rooted in a way that a surface dweller cannot. The land is not just where you live, it is what you live in. This rootedness shows up in the language. Old Icelandic has words for the relationship between person and place that do not translate well into modern English. The concept of land as homeland, eturnjörd, ancestral earth, carries weight that property or real estate cannot capture. You do not just own this land, you are of it. It is of you. And your house grown from that land is an extension of yourself. When you repair it, you are healing yourself. When you expand it, you are growing. When enemies threaten it, they threaten something more intimate than mere property. This connection between identity and architecture helps explain why the turf house design persisted so long in Iceland. Even when other options became available, when trade brought imported timber, when contact with continental Europe introduced new building techniques, Icelanders continued building in turf. It was not just cheaper and easier, though it was both. It was right. It was what a home was supposed to be. The darkness is falling now, the short winter day giving way to the long winter night. You step outside for a moment, needing fresh air, needing to clear your smoke-filled lungs. The wind hits you immediately, cutting through your wool layers, reminding you why you spend so much time underground. You turn and look at your house. From 10 meters away, it is clearly a house. The entrance corridor is visible, the smoke rising from the roof marks it obviously. But you imagine seeing it from further away, from the sea, from a hilltop, and you realize that it would be hard to spot just another hump in the grass-covered landscape. You think about the ships that might come someday. Viking ships, maybe, or Norwegian royal ships, Harald's successors reaching out to remind the exiles who holds power in the Norse world. Or Christian missionaries, which you have heard rumours about, apparently spreading through the Norse settlements like a particularly persistent fungal infection. When they come, whoever they are, they will have trouble finding you. You turn back toward your invisible home, bend down to enter the low doorway, and disappear into the earth. The landscape closes over you like water. It is time to talk about what is growing on your roof. Yes, growing. Your roof is not dead material. It is alive, a miniature meadow suspended above your head, photosynthesizing in summer, dormant in winter, home to insects and small creatures, and the occasional confused sheep that wandered up the slope and did not realize it was standing on someone's terrace. The living roof is one of the most distinctive features of Icelandic turf construction, and also one of the most challenging to get right. A roof that grows sounds poetic. A roof that leaks, sags, collapses, or catches fire is considerably less poetic and considerably more dead. The basic structure starts with a frame. This is where your precious imported wood goes, whatever timber you salvaged from your ship, whatever driftwood you have hoarded, whatever could be traded from ships that occasionally visit the island. The frame needs to be strong enough to support the weight of the turf, which is considerable. Wet turf can weigh over 100 pounds per square foot. Multiply that by the area of a longhouse roof, and you are looking at many tons of material pressing down on your rafters. The traditional Icelandic roof frame was relatively simple. Pairs of rafters meeting at a ridgepole supported by the walls and perhaps by interior posts. The pitch was shallow. Steeper roofs shed water better, but are harder to build and provide less living space beneath them. A pitch of around 20 to 30 degrees was typical, steep enough for drainage, but not so steep that the turf would slide off. Over the frame went a layer of birch branches, if available. These created a supportive mat, preventing the turf from sagging between the rafters. Where birch was not available, other materials substituted: heather, driftwood laths, even whalebone in coastal settlements. The goal was a continuous surface that could support the weight above it. Then came the waterproofing layer. This is critical. Turf is porous, water seeps through it. Without a waterproof barrier between the structural frame and the turf above, moisture would penetrate to the interior, rotting the wood, dripping onto the inhabitants, making the whole enterprise miserable and ultimately fatal. The Vikings used birch bark as their primary waterproofing material. Birch bark is remarkably water-resistant. It contains betulin and other compounds that repel moisture. Sheets of bark, peeled carefully from living trees, were laid in overlapping layers to create a continuous membrane. Where the sheets joined, they were overlapped like fish scales, ensuring that water running down the roof would always flow over the joints rather than into them. Historians still argue about how much birch bark was available to early Icelandic settlers. The birch forests, sparse to begin with, would have been under pressure for both fuel and construction materials. Some evidence suggests that bark was one of the last birch products to become scarce, since it could be harvested without killing the tree. Other evidence indicates that many houses relied on alternative waterproofing: animal hides, seal bladders, even densely compacted turf laid grass side down. Whatever the waterproofing material, it went down in multiple layers. 1 layer was a minimum, 2 was better, 3 was what you did, if you were serious about staying dry. Each layer added weight, added cost, but also added protection against the constant, insistent moisture of the Icelandic climate. Above the waterproofing came the turf itself, 2 layers typically. The bottom layer was laid grass side down, roots pointing up. This created a continuous mat of root material that would help bind the roof together. The top layer was laid grass side up, presenting a living surface to the sky. As the roof settled, the 2 layers began to interweave. Roots from the upper layer grew down into the lower layer. Roots from the lower layer grew into the birch bark and frame below. Within a few years, the roof became a single continuous organism, a living carpet that was surprisingly resistant to wind and weather. But, and there is always a but, living things need maintenance. The grass on your roof needs to be kept from growing too tall. Tall grass catches wind, creates lift, can literally peel the roof off your house into a strong storm. Some households kept goats specifically to graze the roof, letting them wander up the slope and crop the grass to manageable height. This had the additional benefit of providing fertilizer, keeping the grass healthy and vigorous. The problem with goats on your roof is that goats are goats. They dig, they scratch, they find weak spots and make them weaker. A goat that discovers a thin patch in your roof will enthusiastically excavate it, creating a hole that you then have to repair. There are saga accounts of people accidentally falling through roofs, of livestock wandering onto roofs and crashing through, of children playing on roofs and suddenly disappearing into the darkness below. The living roof was a wonderful insulator, an effective camouflage, and also occasionally a trap for the unwary. Repairs were constant. Every autumn, before winter truly set in, you would inspect your roof, look for thin patches, look for places where water had pooled and rotted the turf, look for pest damage. The Icelandic voles loved to tunnel through roof turf, creating channels that weakened the structure. Repairs meant cutting fresh turf, hauling it up to the roof and patching the damaged areas. It meant renewing the birch bark where it had deteriorated. It meant checking the frame for rot and reinforcing where necessary. A well-maintained turf roof could last 20 to 30 years. A neglected one might fail in 5. The labour involved was substantial. Some historians estimate that maintaining a medium-sized turf house required 30 to 50 person days of work per year, just on repairs and upkeep. This was spread throughout the household, men handling the heavy lifting, women often doing the finer work of sealing and finishing, and was simply accepted as part of the rhythm of life. But when the roof was right, when the grass was green and healthy, when the structure was sound, when the layers had knitted together into a unified whole, there was nothing quite like it. The living roof breathed. It absorbed rain without leaking. It insulated against heat and cold alike. It grew more beautiful over time, becoming part of the landscape in a way that dead materials never could. You stand inside your house and look up at your roof. You cannot see the grass, of course, just the dark underbelly of birch bark and packed earth. But you know it is there, growing quietly overhead. In spring, flowers will bloom up there, bees will visit, birds will nest in the eaves. Your house is alive, and as long as you maintain it, as long as you work with it rather than against it, it will keep you alive in return. You have heard the stories about Greenland. Everyone has heard the stories. They filter back through the ships that occasionally visit Iceland. Tales of an even larger island, further west, with grasslands and fjords and space for anyone brave enough to claim it. The man who led the expedition, Eric the Red, was exiled from Iceland for killing someone, which is saying something in a society where killing people is almost socially acceptable if you do it for the right reasons. Eric used his exile productively, exploring this new land, giving it a name designed to attract settlers. Greenland, this is marketing. Pure, shameless early medieval marketing. Greenland is mostly ice. The parts that are not ice are barely more hospitable than Iceland. In fact, they are considerably less hospitable. The growing season is shorter. The winters are longer and harsher. The isolation is more extreme. But Eric the Red was a salesman, and desperate people are easy marks. When he returned from exile and began recruiting colonists, hundreds of Icelanders signed up. They loaded their ships with livestock and tools and hopes and sailed west into the unknown. What they found was a land that demanded everything they had learned in Iceland and then asked for more. The turf house designs that worked in Iceland had to be adapted, strengthened, deepened, more heavily insulated to survive Greenland's conditions. The archaeological remains of Greenlandic Norse farms show houses that are practically bunkers, dug so deep into the earth that they are more underground than above, their walls thicker than anything built in Iceland. Eric himself built his farm at Brattahlid, at the head of a fjord on Greenland's southwestern coast. The remains, excavated by archaeologists in the 20th century, show a complex of buildings that represents the apex of Norse turf construction. The Great Hall was over 50 feet long, its walls of alienating turf and stone rising from foundations buried deep in the permafrost. The Greenlanders faced challenges that even Icelanders did not encounter. The permafrost, permanently frozen ground, made excavation difficult but also created opportunities. A house built into permafrost was essentially built into a giant refrigerator, the frozen earth maintaining stable, cold temperatures year-round. This was bad for human comfort, but excellent for food storage. The Greenlandic houses also show evidence of even more extreme human-animal integration than Icelandic homes. In Greenland, livestock warmth was not just useful, it was essential. Houses were designed to maximize heat transfer from animals to humans with minimal separation between the species. Historians still argue about how the Greenland settlers managed psychologically. The isolation was extreme. Weeks of sailing from Iceland, months from Europe. The population was never large, probably never exceeding a few thousand. Everyone knew everyone. Marriage options were limited, the same faces year after year, with almost no variation. And then there was the darkness. Greenland is further north than most of Iceland, and the winter darkness is correspondingly deeper. For weeks around the solstice, the sun does not rise at all. The people lived in their turf houses in their smoke-filled darkness, waiting for the light to return, but they persisted. For nearly 500 years, the Norse Greenland colony survived. They raised cattle and sheep, they hunted seals and walrus, they traded luxury goods, walrus ivory, polar bear furs, narwhal tusks, with Europe. They built churches and accepted Christianity. They maintained contact with Iceland and Norway. And then, sometime in the 15th century, they vanished. The last written records of the Greenland Norse dates to a wedding in 1408. After that, silence. When ships finally returned to check on the colony decades later, they found empty farms, abandoned churches, no survivors. What happened is one of history's great mysteries. Climate change probably played a role. The medieval warm period was ending, temperatures were dropping, and Greenland was becoming less hospitable. The Black Death devastated Iceland and Norway. disrupting the trade networks that Greenland depended on. The Inuit, expanding southward from the Arctic, may have come into conflict with the Norse, though evidence for violent displacement is limited. Some scholars believe the Greenlanders simply gave up. Unable to adapt to worsening conditions, unwilling or unable to adopt Inuit survival strategies, they abandoned their farms and tried to sail back to Iceland. Whether they made it, whether they perished at sea, whether they tried to make contact and were turned away, all of this is speculation. What remains are the turf houses, the ruins, the foundations dug into hillsides, the collapsed walls of turf and stone, the empty fire pits where flames once burned. The houses outlasted the people who built them, standing as monuments to ambition, adaptability, and ultimately failure. You think about this sometimes during the long winter nights. You think about the people who looked at Iceland and thought, I can do better, who pushed further into the unknown, who tested the limits of what turf construction and Norse determination could achieve. They found those limits. In the end, the world was simply too harsh, or they were too inflexible, or some combination of both. But for 500 years their turf houses kept them alive. That is not nothing. That is generation after generation of people born and raised and growing old in earth-sheltered homes, in the most extreme habitable environment on Earth. The technology worked. The houses worked. What failed was something else. Economics, climate, luck. The brutal mathematics of population too small and too isolated to sustain itself. You pull your cloak tighter and resolve for the 1000th time to maintain your walls, to tend your roof, to keep your house alive. The alternative is becoming a mystery for future generations to puzzle over. And then there was Vinland. You have heard the stories, passed from ship to ship, from fireside to fireside. Somewhere to the west, beyond Greenland, there is land. Leif Erikson found it, they say. Leif Erik the Red Sun, sailing west from Greenland and stumbling onto shores covered with trees and wild grapes. Trees. The word hits different when you have spent years on a treeless island, hoarding driftwood, measuring your wealth in planks. The saga accounts describe 3 regions Leif named. Helluland, land of flat stones. Markland, land of forests. And Vinland, land of wine, named for the grapes that supposedly grew wild there. Modern scholars identify Helluland with Baffin Island, Markland with Labrador, and Vinland somewhere further south, maybe Newfoundland, maybe the Gulf of St. Lawrence, maybe even further down the North American coast. The exact locations remain debated, but the basic thrust is accepted. The Vikings reached North America around 1000 CE, nearly 500 years before Columbus. And when they got there, they built turf houses. The archaeological proof lies at L'Anse aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland. There, in the 1960s, archaeologists discovered the remains of a Norse settlement, not just Viking artifacts, but actual buildings. And those buildings were turf construction, identical in technique to what you would find in Iceland or Greenland. Imagine the scene. You have sailed across the North Atlantic, pushing further west than any European has ever ventured. You have reached a land of forests. Actual forests, trees as far as you can see, timber, enough to build a fleet of ships. And what do? Well, you build a turf house. This makes sense when you think about it. The settlers who reached Vinland knew turf construction. They had spent their lives in turf houses. They had the skills, the techniques, the instinctive understanding of how to work with earth and grass. They did not have the same deep familiarity with log cabin construction or timber framing. More practically, turf construction is faster. Much faster. You can cut turf blocks and stack walls in a fraction of the time it takes to fell trees, square timber, and join beams. For a small, expeditionary party that needs shelter before winter, speed matters more than permanence. The L'Anse aux Meadows buildings were clearly temporary. They were base camps, not permanent settlements. The Norse came to Vinland to exploit resources, timber, furs, iron bog ore, and to return home with their loot. They did not come to stay. Why they did not stay is another one of those historical debates that may never be resolved. The sagas mention conflict with the indigenous people, whom the Norse called Skrælings. There may have been violence, casualties, a realization that holding this distant territory was more trouble than it was worth. There were also logistics problems. Vinland was desperately far from anything resembling Norse civilization. The voyage from Greenland was risky enough. From Iceland, it was even worse, maintaining regular contact, supplying a colony, sending reinforcements if needed. All of this would have been extraordinarily difficult. So the Vinland experiment ended. The Norse packed up and went home, leaving behind their turf houses to slowly collapse and be reclaimed by the land. For 1,000 years, the ruins are hidden, evidence of a European presence in America that was forgotten, dismissed, or simply not believed. When archaeologists finally confirmed the site in the 1960s, it rewrote history. But for our purposes, what matters is what the site reveals about turf construction. Even at the very edge of the known world, facing a completely unfamiliar environment, the Vikings fell back on what they knew. Turf construction was not just a building technique. It was a portable skill set, a way of transforming any grassy landscape into shelter. Whether in Iceland, Greenland, or Newfoundland, the basic principles held. Find turf, cut blocks, stack walls, dig in. Historians still argue about how well the Vinland turf houses worked. Newfoundland is considerably warmer than Iceland or Greenland, with milder winters and more rainfall. The thermal requirements were different. The drainage challenges were probably worse. The specific characteristics of North American turf were unknown to the builders, but they made it work, at least well enough to survive the time they spent there, well enough to gather resources and repair ships and wait out storms before sailing back to Greenland. The turf house at Lonzo Meadows was small, more like a workshop than a proper longhouse. But it shared the same DNA as the grand halls of Iceland, the sunken farmsteads of Greenland, even your own modest home on its Icelandic hillside. All of you, across 1,000 miles and wildly varying conditions, solved shelter the same way. Earth, grass, stone, fire, the materials change, the proportions adjust, the details evolve, but the core remains. You wake to the sound of women's voices singing. The song is old. You do not remember where you first heard it, or who taught it to you. It seems to have always existed, passed from mother to daughter through generations beyond counting. The melody is simple, almost monotonous, rising and falling like waves or like the rhythm of walking a great distance. The women are working at the loom. This is what winters are for in a turf house. The darkness outside makes outdoor work impossible. The cold makes it unbearable. But inside there is warmth and light enough for textile production. And textile production never stops because fabric wears out, because growing children need new clothes, because wool is one of Iceland's few export goods, because there is simply no end to the need for cloth. The women's domain in the turf house was defined by this work. The central living space with its loom and spinning equipment was where most domestic labour happened. The platforms along the walls were where women sat for hours, their hands busy with spindles or needles, their voices filling the summery air with songs and stories. Historians still argue about the status of women in Viking society. Some evidence suggests significant power and independence. Women could own property, initiate divorce, inherit land. The sagas feature female characters who are clever, fierce, and consequential. But other evidence paints a grimmer picture. Domestic violence, limited legal rights, the constant burden of reproductive labour in an era when childbirth was dangerous and child mortality was high. The turf house was, in many ways, a woman's workplace. Men might be absent for months, sailing, trading, raiding, hunting, but women remained, keeping the home fires burning in a literal as well as figurative sense. They managed the household economy, they processed the dairy products that sustained life through winter. They preserved the fish and meat that's stored in cool corners of the house. They turned raw wool into finished fabric through a process that consumed countless hours of patient labour. The wool itself came from sheep, the descendants of animals brought over on the year. Settlement voyages adapted over generations to Icelandic conditions. Icelandic sheep have a double fleece, a longer, coarser outer layer called tog, and a shorter, softer inner layer called thel. These layers serve different purposes in textile production. The tog makes durable outerwear, water-resistant and windproof. The thel makes softer garments worn against the skin. Shearing happened in early summer. The raw wool was washed, carded to align the fibres, and spun into thread on the drop spindles. This was constant, portable work. Women spun while walking, while supervising children, while doing anything that did not require both hands. The drop spindle dangled at their side, twisting wool into thread through the mechanical magic of angular momentum. The spun thread then went to the loom. Icelandic looms were vertical, warp-weighted, with stone weights dangling at the bottom to keep the threads taut. Weaving on these looms was slow, methodical work, each pass of the weft adding a fraction of an inch to the growing fabric. A single cloak might represent weeks of weaving, and weeks more of spinning before that. The finished fabric was fulled, washed and pounded to thicken and strengthen it. The lanolin remaining in the wool made it water-resistant. When needed, fabrics could be dyed with natural pigments, blues from woad, reds from some meadow, yellows from various local plants. All of this happened in the turf house. The loom stood in the main hall, positioned to catch what little light came through the smoke hole or skin-covered windows. The rhythmic thump of the weaving was a constant background sound, as familiar as the crackling fire or the breathing of livestock. Children grew up surrounded by this work. Girls learned to spin as soon as their coordination allowed, maybe 4 or 5 years old. They graduated to weaving later, mastering the patterns and techniques that their mothers had learned from their mothers. Boys learned other skills, agricultural, maritime, martial, but they also grew up watching women's work, understanding its rhythms, respecting its importance. Because here is the thing about textile production into the Viking world. It was economically critical, fabric was valuable, it could be traded, used as currency, offered as gifts. The labour that went into producing it represented a significant fraction of any household's productive capacity, and it was exclusively women's work. Men might shear sheep or carry finished goods to market, but the transformation of raw wool into finished fabric was a female domain. This gave women economic power, even if social norms limited how that power could be expressed. In the dim, smoky interior of the turf house, surrounded by the tools of their trade, women built the material basis of Viking civilization. The ships got the glory, the battles got the sagas, but without the fabric that kept people warm, without the processed wool that could be traded for metal and timber and other necessities, none of the rest would have been possible. You listen to the singing, the steady rhythm of the loom, the domestic sounds that mean safety and continuity. The women's work will continue through the winter months, producing cloth that will keep bodies warm and provide trade goods for when the sailing season returns. The turf house is not just shelter. It is a factory, a workplace, an economic unit centered on the labor of women. You close your eyes and let the singing carry you back towards sleep. Tomorrow there will be more work. There is always more work. But for now, this moment, the rhythm holds. There is something sacred about living underground. You do not think about it consciously. You're too busy with the practical demands of survival to spend much time on theological speculation. But in the quiet moments, when the fire has burned low and the household sleeps and you lie awake staring into darkness, you sometimes sense it. A feeling of being held, cradled, protected by something larger than yourself. The Norse had complicated relationships with the earth. Their cosmology placed the human world, Midgard, in the centre of a vast tree whose roots reached down into realms of darkness. Below Midgard lay Hel, the realm of the dead, and Niflheim, the frozen underworld. The dwarves lived underground in halls of stone, crafting the magical artifacts that gods and heroes prized. To burrow into the earth, then, was to approach something sacred. Not the bright, sky-dwelling sacred of Odin and Thor, but something older, darker, more primal, the sacred of roots and stones and the slow, patient work of decay and rebirth. Historians still argue about the religious significance of turf house architecture. Some scholars see clear symbolic connections, the house as womb, the entrance corridor as birth canal, the emergence into the smoky interior as a kind of daily resurrection. Others dismiss this as overinterpretation, pointing out that practical concerns can explain every feature without recourse to symbolism, but the two explanations are not mutually exclusive. Humans have a tendency to find meaning in their environment, to overlay practical structures with symbolic significance. The house that keeps you alive becomes the house that represents life. The fire that warms your body becomes the fire that represents the soul. There are strange traditions around turf houses that hint at deeper meanings. The high seat pillars, those sacred wooden posts that migrants brought from their Norwegian homes, these were often buried at the base, their lower ends sunk into the earth of the new land. Some scholars interpret this as a practical measure, ensuring stability. Others see a ritual of connection, literally rooting the household in its new home. The placement of the dead also suggests complex relationships between houses and earth. In the early settlement period, Before Christianity arrived and imposed its own burial customs, thus, Norse practiced varied mortuary rituals. Some dead were buried in mounds near the farm, some were interred beneath the floor of the house itself. Some were cremated, their ashes scattered or buried. Burying the dead beneath the house was not uncommon. Excavations of Icelandic turf houses have turned up burials within the structure itself, sometimes in doorways, sometimes beneath platforms, sometimes in seemingly random locations. These were usually infants or children, though adult burials occur too. Why bury the dead inside the house? The reasons were probably multiple. Keeping the deceased close, maintaining a connection to ancestors, perhaps even believing that the spirits of the dead provided some kind of protection or blessing to the living. The house became not just a shelter for the living, but a dwelling shared with the dead, a multi-generational structure spanning the boundary between worlds. This adds a layer of meaning to the semi-subterranean design. You are not just digging into the earth for practical reasons. You are creating a space that exists between worlds, above the realm of the dead but below the open sky, sheltered from the gods' gaze while remaining connected to them through the smoke that rises from your fire. The arrival of Christianity changed some of these practices. The church forbade burial in non-consecrated ground, moving the dead from house floors to churchyard cemeteries. The high seat pillars associated with pagan ritual fell out of favour. The explicit connections between house and cosmology were suppressed, but older beliefs have a way of persisting beneath the surface. Folk traditions recorded centuries later still spoke of house spirits, vattir, that needed to be propitiated. Moving into a new house required rituals of acknowledgement, offerings of food or drink to whatever invisible entities might already be in residence. The threshold of the house, the boundary between inside and outside, was treated as magically significant, a place where protection spells might be carved or buried. The turf house, embedded in the earth, was always more than just a building. It was a participation in the landscape and a collaboration between human need and natural material that carried implications beyond mere shelter. To live in such a house was to live in relationship with the land, to acknowledge dependence on forces beyond human control, to accept that survival required working with nature rather than against it. You feel this in your bones, even if you cannot articulate it. The walls around you are not just walls, they are compressed earth, living grass, the accumulated growth of centuries. They are the land itself, shaped to human purpose but never fully domesticated. When you press your hand against the turf, you feel it breathing. Not literally, of course, but there is movement. The slow settling of compressed material, the subtle flex of root systems adjusting to moisture and temperature. The house is alive in a way that a timber house is not. It continues to grow, to change, to respond to conditions. It is a process as much as a product. And in this aliveness, perhaps, lies the sacred. Not the sacred of temples and altars, but the sacred of participation in something larger than yourself. The sacred of being held by the earth, sheltered by the grass, kept alive by the same forces that make seeds sprout and storms gather and seasons turn. And you do not pray. Not in any formal sense, but you are grateful, and in the darkness of your turf house surrounded by the living walls, that gratitude feels like enough. The fire has been burning continuously for months now. You add fuel in the morning, you add fuel in the evening, you check it during the night, those strange half-waking moments when you rise from your blankets to ensure the flames have not died. The fire is the heart of the house, and a stopped heart means death. But the fire is also the centre of something else. The social life, that makes winter bearable. The long Icelandic nights created conditions for a particular kind of culture. In the darkness, with everyone confined to the same smoky space, storytelling flourished. The sagas, those long intricate narratives of gods and heroes, of family feuds and political intrigue, were composed and transmitted around fires like yours. The poetry of the Skalds, with its complex meters and elaborate metaphors, was performed for audiences seated on platforms like the ones you now recline on. This was oral culture at its most sophisticated. In the absence of books, the only way to preserve knowledge was to remember it. And the only way to remember long, complex narratives was to embed them in patterns. Rhythms, rhymes, repetitions that served as mnemonic scaffolding. The meters of Old Norse poetry were incredibly elaborate. The most prestigious form, drottkvætt, required specific patterns of alliteration, specific syllable counts, specific stress patterns. It was a puzzle as much as an art form. and composing in it required years of training and practice, but even prose storytelling had its techniques. The saga tellers knew how to build tension, how to release it. They knew when to elaborate and when to be brief. They understood their audience, the gasps, the laughs, the moments of rapt silence, and shaped their performances accordingly. The Turf House was the natural venue for this art. The acoustics were intimate, the audience captive, the atmosphere charged with smoke and firelight. The storyteller's face was lit from below by the flames, casting dramatic shadows. The listeners leaned in, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire and the breathing of the livestock. This was entertainment, yes, but it was also education. The sagas transmitted knowledge about the past, about social norms, about consequences. Young people learned from the stories what happened to those who violated honor codes, who started feuds carelessly, who failed in their obligations. The stories were conservative in the original sense. They conserved knowledge, preserved patterns that helped society function. There were also practical skills transmitted in these gatherings. The secrets of navigation, the lore of farming, the craft of boat building. Older men told younger men how things were done. Older women instructed younger women in the mysteries of dyeing and weaving. The house was a school, the fire its classroom. Historians still argue about literacy rates in medieval Iceland. Some evidence suggests Iceland was relatively literate, at least after Christianity arrived with its manuscript culture. But even if some people could read, books were rare and extensive. Oral transmission remained primary for most knowledge even after the technology of writing became available. And the content of the stories shaped identity. The Icelandic settlers were acutely conscious of being a new society, founded by people who had left their homelands behind. The stories they told reinforced connections to that past while also creating a distinctive Icelandic identity. They remembered where they came from, but they also celebrated what they were becoming. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, is essentially a saga of origin, a massive genealogical project that traces almost every Icelandic family back to the original settlers. It was written down eventually, but it began as oral tradition, stories passed from generation to generation in houses like yours. You think about your own ancestors, about the stories you know, your grandmother's grandmother, who survived a shipwreck. Your grandfather's feud with a neighbouring family, eventually settled with a payment of silver. The cousin who sailed west with Eric the Red and was never seen again. These stories are your inheritance, as real as the turf walls around you. Someday, if you have children who have children, they will tell stories about you. About the voyage from Norway, about the building of this house, about winters survived and summers endured. You'll become part of the narrative, a link in the chain connecting past to future. The fire crackles. Someone begins a story you have heard before, but you listen anyway. The story is never exactly the same twice. The teller adjusts for the audience, emphasizes different details, adds or subtracts based on mood and occasion. The same story, told across generations, is also a different story, evolving like a living thing. Like the house itself. Like everything here. You settle into your platform, your back against the cool turf wall, your face warmed by the fire. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, the story continues. This is how cultures survive the dark. Let us talk about the things that kill you. Not the dramatic deaths, the shipwrecks, the feuds, the occasional volcanic eruption. Those make the sagas. Those get remembered. The deaths that define daily life are quieter, less storied, more relentless. Disease, first and always. The smoky interior of the turf house filled with humans and animals and the organic waste that both produce was a paradise for pathogens. Tuberculosis thrived in the close quarters. Intestinal parasites spread easily when sanitation was primitive and food preparation happened in shared spaces. Respiratory infections cut through households like scythes through grain. The archaeological evidence is grim. Bones from Viking-era Icelandic burials show patterns of chronic infection, nutritional deficiency, accumulated trauma. Arthritis was common, probably from the endless physical labour. Dental disease was rampant, though perhaps less severe than in societies with more sugar in their diets. Childhood mortality was catastrophically high. Some estimates suggest half of all children did not survive to adulthood. And then there were the vermin. mice, rats eventually once ships brought them, fleas in the bedding, and the animal quarters, lice in hair and clothing. These were not just nuisances, they were disease vectors, carrying pathogens from animal to human, from the waste piles to the food stores. The turf house, with its many crevices and its organic structure, was impossible to keep vermin-free. The mice lived in the walls, nested in the roof, gnawed through stored food despite every precaution. You set traps, you kept cats if you could get them. You accepted a certain baseline of pest presence as simply normal. The floors were particularly problematic. Earthen floors, despite being practical and cheap, accumulated filth, spilled food, animal waste tracked in from the byre, human waste in an era before indoor plumbing. The floors were layered with rushes or straw which helped absorb some of the mess, but these too became repositories of organic matter, replaced periodically but never really cleaned. Historians still argue about how dirty turf houses actually were. Some suggest that the constant presence of smoke had a preservative sanitizing effect. Others point to the archaeological evidence of insect remains, parasite eggs, accumulated refuse, and conclude that conditions were genuinely appalling. The truth is probably that standards were different. What would horrify a modern person was simply normal life for a medieval Icelander. The smoke was everywhere, yes. The smell of animals was inescapable. The insects were constant companions. But this was the baseline, the only reality anyone knew. Complaining about it would have been like complaining about gravity. Winters were the worst. The long months of confinement with minimal ventilation, with everyone eating, sleeping and working in the same space, concentrated the problems. By spring, the air quality was atrocious. The first warm days, when people could finally throw open the doors and let fresh air circulate, must have felt like resurrection. The animals, though essential for warmth, contributed their own health hazards. Diseases jumped species, tuberculosis again, probably, and various other zoonotic infections. The close proximity meant that animal parasites became human parasites, that pathogens had short distances to travel, and food storage in the pre-refrigeration era was always a gamble. Meat was preserved through smoking, drying, fermenting and whey. Fish was dried until it was hard as wood. Dairy products were processed into forms that could last. Skyr, butter, cheese. But even with these techniques, spoilage happened. Eating spoiled food meant illness. Serious illness meant death. The winter months, when supplies were dwindling and replacement was impossible, were times of careful calculation. How much remained? How long until supplies could be refreshed? Could the household make it through? Or would someone have to be sent away to reduce the number of mouths? The stories of lean winters are harrowing. People eating their seed grain, dooming the next year's crop, people slaughtering, breeding stock, reducing their long-term survival prospects to avoid immediate starvation. People dying quietly in the darkness of turf houses, their bodies sometimes not discovered until spring. You've been lucky so far. Your first winters have been hard but not catastrophic. You've learned to manage supplies, to plan for contingencies, to keep reserves against the unexpected. But you know how thin the margin is. One bad season, one failed harvest, one epidemic sweeping through the livestock and everything changes. The turf house keeps you warm. It does not keep you safe. Safety is an illusion here, a comfort for people in gentler climates. You survive each winter. You hope to survive the next. That is all anyone can do. The roof is leaking again. You noticed it yesterday, a dark stain spreading across the turf above your sleeping platform, a slow drip that will become a constant trickle if you do not address it. The birch bark waterproofing has failed somewhere, or the turf has compacted unevenly, or something has disturbed the living surface. A grazing animal, perhaps, or just the accumulated wear of another Icelandic winter. This is not unusual. This is not even unexpected. This is simply what life in a turf house entails. The maintenance of these structures was never finished. From the day you laid the first foundation stone to the day you finally abandoned the building, and turf houses were always eventually abandoned, replaced, rebuilt, there was always something that needed attention. The roof was the most demanding. The living surface required constant management, trimming the grass, patching bare spots, ensuring drainage channels remained clear. The waterproofing layer beneath deteriorated over time. especially at joints and seams. The wooden frame, hidden under layers of earth, was vulnerable to rot and insect damage. Annual inspections were essential. Every autumn, before the winter rains and snows set in, careful examination of the roof, structure, probing for soft spots, for places where the wood had begun to fail, peeling back turf to check the birch bark beneath, replacing sections as needed. The walls required attention too, though less frequently. Turf walls settle over the years, compacting under their own weight, sometimes developing bulges or lean where the loading was uneven. Left uncorrected, these problems worsened. A small bulge became a significant deformation. A slight lean became a structural failure waiting to happen. Repairing turf walls meant cutting new blocks, carefully removing deteriorated material, fitting the fresh turf into the existing structure. The skill lay in matching the new to the old and ensuring that the repairs blended seamlessly, that the root systems would eventually grow together. Drainage was a constant battle. Iceland is wet. Rain falls frequently, sometimes horizontally in the fierce winds. Snow accumulates, then melts in sudden thaws. All of this water wants to flow downward, and if it flows into your house, you have problems. The drainage channels around the foundation needed regular clearing. Debris accumulated, leaves, dirt, the detritus of daily life. And if the channels became blocked, water backed up and seeped through the stone foundation into the earthen floor. Wet floors led to rot, to mould, to the gradual destruction of any organic material stored at ground level. Inside drainage was equally critical. The slight slope of the floor, from the human living area down toward the animal quarters and out the entrance, had to be maintained. If the floor settled unevenly, if depressions formed where water could pool, the problems compounded. Historians still argue about how labour-intensive turf house maintenance actually was. Some estimates suggest it consumed a significant fraction of total household labour time. Others argue that the work, while constant, was not particularly burdensome. A few hours here and there, spread throughout the year, easily incorporated into other activities. The truth probably varied. A new house in good condition required less maintenance than an old house in poor condition. A household with ample labour could stay ahead of problems. One stretched thin might fall behind deferring repairs until they became crises. There was also accumulated knowledge to consider. An experienced householder knew what to watch for, when to intervene, how to prevent small problems from becoming large ones. A novice might miss early warning signs, might not know how to properly execute repairs, might make things worse through well-intentioned but misguided efforts. You're still learning. Each repair teaches you something about the behaviour of turf under stress, about the way water finds its way through even seemingly solid barriers, about the organic, living nature of the structure you inhabit. The leak in your roof will be fixed, probably this week when the weather cooperates. You will cut fresh turf, peel back the damaged section, check the birch bark, patch or replace as necessary. It is tedious work, cold and wet, but it is work you understand, and when you are done, when the repair is complete and the drip has stopped, you will have a brief window of satisfaction before the next problem appears. Because there is always a next problem. That is just what houses are, especially houses made of living earth. The priest arrives with the spring thaw. He is not what you expected. Thin, pale, visibly suffering from the sea voyage, but possessed of a certainty that seems impervious to physical discomfort. He has come to tell you about a god who died on a tree, and he will not be deterred by your initial skepticism. Christianity comes to Iceland gradually, then suddenly. For decades, missionaries have been working the island, converting individuals, establishing small footholds. Then, in the year 1000, the Althing, the National Assembly, debates the matter and decides, after tense deliberation, that Iceland will be Christian. The conversion is more political than spiritual. The alternative was civil war between Christian and pagan factions, and the pragmatic Icelanders chose unity over doctrinal purity. People are permitted to continue private pagan practices for a time to ease the transition, but publicly, officially, the old gods are set aside. What does this mean for your turf house? More than you might expect. Christianity brought new ideas about sacred space. The old religion had been decentralized, rituals conducted at farms and groves, at natural features imbued with spiritual significance. Christianity demanded churches, consecrated ground, a separation between sacred and profane. The turf house, with its integrated living and working and sleeping spaces, with its burials beneath the floor, with its high-seat pillars rooted in the earth, was a kind of pagan sacred space. Not a temple exactly, but a place where domestic and spiritual life were intertwined, where the boundaries between human and divine, living and dead, were permeable. The church insisted on new boundaries. The dead must be buried in consecrated ground, in churchyards, not under kitchen floors. Rituals must happen in designated spaces, with designated officials. The home was desacralized, rendered merely domestic, while the spiritual was concentrated in specific authorized locations. This was never complete, of course. Folk beliefs persisted. People continued to leave offerings for house spirits, to observe rituals around thresholds and hearths. The church railed against these practices, but they proved stubbornly resilient. Historians still argue about how thoroughly Christian Iceland actually became in the early conversion period. Some evidence suggests superficial acceptance. People adopted the new prayers, the new festivals, the new iconography, while maintaining older beliefs beneath the surface. Other evidence points to genuine spiritual transformation, at least for some individuals. The architecture adapted. Churches were built, initially small and simple, using the same turf construction techniques as houses. The earliest Icelandic churches were essentially turf houses with altars, the same grass roofs, the same earth walls, the same semi-subterranean design. Over time, churches became more elaborate, more distinct from domestic buildings. Stone construction became more common for churches even while houses remained turf. The visual differentiation reinforced the theological separation. The church was not like home, was elevated above ordinary domestic space. But the turf house itself changed more subtly. The high-seat pillars, with their pagan associations, gradually disappeared. The practice of domestic burial ended. The specific rituals around hearth and threshold evolved, lost some of their overt spiritual character while retaining traces of older meanings. The conversion also brought literacy. The church valued written texts, scriptures, laws, contracts. Iceland developed a manuscript culture that would eventually produce the great written sagas, but ironically, that manuscript culture also preserved much of what the church was trying to suppress. The sagas, written down by Christian monks, recorded pagan beliefs and practices in detail that would otherwise have been lost. You listen to the priest, his Latin and his stories of a distant Holy Land. You nod in appropriate places. You will accept baptism because that is what is done now, because refusing means becoming an outsider in your own community. But alone in your turf house in the darkness, you still feel the presence of older things. The earth around you is the same earth your ancestors knew. The fire in the hearth burns with the same hunger it has always had. The spirits of the land, if they exist, did not depart simply because a vote was taken at the Althing. The house holds you, as it always has. What you call the things that hold you is, perhaps less, important than the holding itself. The priest is talking about eternal life. You look at your turf walls, slowly settling, slowly decomposing, slowly returning to the earth from which they came. Everything is always returning to the earth. Perhaps that is its own kind of eternity. The centuries pass and the turf house changes. Not quickly, nothing in Iceland happens quickly, but relentlessly, inevitably. The techniques that served your grandparents serve you differently now. The meanings attached to earthen walls shift as society shifts around them. By the later medieval period, turf construction has become a marker of something it was not before. Poverty. The wealthy import timber. They build in styles that echo continental European fashions. Stone becomes prestigious where it is available. The turf house, once universal, becomes associated with those who cannot afford alternatives. This is strange if you think about it. The thermal properties of turf have not changed. The material is still abundant, still free for the cutting. The design principles that made semi-subterranean construction effective still apply. But prestige works by its own logic, and prestige in Iceland increasingly flows from connections to the wider European world. The fishing industry transforms the economy. Dried fish becomes Iceland's primary export, traded to merchants from across northern Europe. Wealth concentrates in coastal villages. The old dispersed pattern of farmsteads begins to shift toward more concentrated settlement. With this concentration comes new building types. Fish drying facilities, warehouses, trading posts. These are built from whatever materials are available, turf when necessary, but increasingly timber and stone where possible. The Black Death reaches Iceland in the 15th century, killing perhaps half the population. The labour shortage that follows changes everything. Farms are abandoned, skills are lost as the people who possess them die without passing them on. The meticulous maintenance that turf houses require becomes harder to sustain. Historians still argue about how much the plague transformed Icelandic society. Some see it as a fundamental rupture, ending the old world and beginning something new. Others argue that the changes were gradual, that the plague accelerated trends already underway. What is clear is that the post-plague world was different. The population that eventually recovered was smaller, more concentrated, more integrated into European trade networks. The isolation that had characterized the settlement period was giving way to connection. And connection brought comparison. Icelanders who travelled to Norway, to Denmark, to England, saw how other people lived. They saw timber houses with proper chimneys. They saw glass windows. They saw furniture and decoration that seemed impossibly luxurious compared to the spare functionality of turf house interiors. The returning travellers brought expectations. They brought dissatisfaction with what had seemed perfectly adequate before. They brought shame. This shame attached itself to turf construction. The houses that had kept ancestors alive through brutal winters became embarrassments. Travellers' accounts from the 16th and 17th centuries describe Icelandic turf houses with a mixture of fascination and horror. The darkness, the smoke, the intimate cohabitation with animals. The Icelanders themselves internalised some of this perspective. Literary references to turf houses become less celebratory, more apologetic. The design innovations that had made these structures so effective are forgotten or dismissed. People continue building in turf because they have no choice, not because they are proud of the tradition. This is the tragedy of cultural shame. The accumulated wisdom of centuries, the solutions that brilliant, desperate people develop to survive impossible conditions, become something to hide rather than celebrate. The knowledge degrades as transmission falters. Skills that should have been passed down are lost because no one wants to be associated with backward, primitive construction. Not that turf construction ever completely disappeared. Even in the 19th and 20th centuries, even as concrete and corrugated metal became available, some Icelanders continued building in turf. Some from necessity, they could not afford alternatives. Some from choice, a stubborn attachment to traditional methods. The last turf houses built for actual habitation date from the mid-20th century. A few decades after people walked on the moon, Icelanders were still constructing semi-subterranean earthen dwellings, not as many, not as elaborately. But the tradition, beaten down but never killed, persisted. And then something strange happened. Scholars began to take interest. Archaeologists excavated old sites documenting what remained. Historians pieced together the methods and meanings that had been nearly lost. Architects and engineers analysed the thermal performance and discovered what the Vikings knew intuitively, that turf construction was sophisticated, effective, sustainable. The rehabilitation was slow but steady. What had been shameful became heritage. What had been backward became visionary. The turf house, after centuries of declining status, began its ascent back to respectability. You would not have predicted this all those centuries ago. You just built what worked, with what you had, to survive conditions that wanted you dead. But the wisdom in those walls persisted, waiting to be rediscovered. The archaeologist kneels in your house, not your house anymore. You have been dead for 1,000 years, but the walls you built, the floors you walked, the fire pit where you burned driftwood through long winter nights, these remain, buried under centuries of accumulated soil, waiting to tell their stories. Archaeological excavation of turf houses is painstaking work. The organic materials that make up the structure, turf, wood, bone, textile, are fragile. The stratigraphy is complex, layers of occupation alternating with layers of collapse and rebuilding. What looks like a single house might represent centuries of continuous habitation, each generation modifying what the previous generation built. The tools are delicate: trowels, brushes, dental picks. The work proceeds centimetre by centimetre, each layer documented before it is removed, photographed, measured, analysed. What seems like empty dirt contains information. Microscopic remains of pollen that reveal what plants grew nearby, insect fragments that indicate storage conditions, chemical signatures that map where different activities occurred. Historians still argue about how to interpret what excavations reveal. Physical evidence is fragmentary, ambiguous, open to multiple readings. A burned layer might indicate a catastrophic fire or a deliberate demolition. A burial might be honoured an ancestor or executed criminal. The artefacts do not explain themselves. They require interpretation, and interpretation is always shaped by the interpreter. But some findings are less ambiguous. The basic layout of turf houses, consistent across sites and centuries. The placement of hearths, platforms, animal quarters. The evidence of ongoing repair and renovation. Layers of patched turf, replaced beams, modified floor plans. What emerges from this archaeology is a picture of sophisticated adaptation. People who understood their environment intimately, who developed solutions that balanced competing demands, who maintained buildings through conditions that would destroy lesser structures. The preservation of turf houses is challenging. The organic materials that constitute them continue to decay, even underground. Exposure to air accelerates deterioration. The act of excavation, by removing protective soil layers, often hastens destruction, even as it reveals what was hidden. Some sites are reburied after excavation, protected by layers of soil and geotextile for future researchers with better methods. Others are conserved in place, stabilized with modern materials that introduce their own complications. Still others are reconstructed, rebuilt based on archaeological evidence, offering visitors an experience of walking into the past. The reconstructions are controversial. How accurate can they be? Every choice, the specific turf used, the way blocks are stacked, the treatment of surfaces, represents an interpretation. The results are convincing enough to be educational, but they are not the real thing. They are modern creations inspired by ancient originals, and yet the reconstructions serve purposes that surviving original structures cannot. They can be entered, experienced, smelled. The smoke of an actual fire fills the space. The darkness is authentic darkness, not museum lighting. Visitors can feel in their bodies what it meant to live in such a space. The sensory experience of entering a reconstructed turf house stays with people. The initial darkness, overwhelming after outdoor brightness. The smell of earth and smoke and grass. The close, intimate scale of the interior. The way sound behaves differently, absorbed by soft walls rather than reflected by hard surfaces. This is knowledge that cannot be transmitted through text or images. It must be embodied, experienced, felt. The reconstructions make this possible, imperfectly but vitally. You built a house to survive. The fact that people still learn from it, still study it, still enter reconstructions of it a millennium later. This would have surprised you. You were thinking about next winter, not next century. But here we are. Your walls are museum exhibits now. Your techniques are academic papers. Your desperation has become heritage. There is something fitting about this. The knowledge passes forward, adapted and reinterpreted, but still connected to what you knew, and the thread remains unbroken. The modern architect picks up the trowel. She is not going to dig into an archaeological site. She is going to build something new using principles that are very old and build a structure that responds to contemporary concerns. Energy efficiency, sustainability, connection to landscape, using methods that your ancient ancestors would have recognized. Earth-sheltered architecture has experienced a renaissance. In a world confronting climate change, fossil fuel dependence, and the environmental costs of conventional construction, the old ways suddenly look visionary. Passive solar design, natural insulation, thermal mass, living roofs, all of these concepts developed millennia ago by people solving survival problems turn out to be exactly what a sustainable future requires. The parallels between ancient turf construction and contemporary green building are striking. Both aim to minimize energy inputs by working with natural systems rather than against them. Both prioritize thermal comfort through design rather than mechanical intervention. Both integrate buildings into landscapes, blurring the boundary between human construction and natural environment. Of course, modern earth-sheltered buildings incorporate technologies that would have seemed magical to an Icelandic settler. Precise moisture barriers, engineered drainage systems, insulated glazing that admits light while blocking heat loss, mechanical ventilation that ensures air quality without sacrificing thermal performance. The smoke problem, in particular, has been solved. You no longer have to choose between breathing and warmth. Modern wood stoves with proper flues burn clean and efficient. Heat recovery ventilators exchange stale interior air for fresh exterior air, while capturing most of the thermal energy. Historians still argue about whether calling modern earth-sheltered construction a continuation of ancient turf building is accurate or appropriation. Some see a genuine lineage, a tradition adapted to new conditions. Others point out that the modern versions are so transformed as to be something entirely different, inspired by ancient forms but not continuous with them. The semantic debate matters less than the practical reality. The principles work. Buildings that use earth for thermal mass and insulation, that employ living roofs, that burrow into hillsides, these perform exceptionally well by contemporary measures. Low energy consumption, stable interior temperatures, minimal environmental impact. The aesthetic dimension has also shifted. Where turf construction was once associated with poverty and backwardness, modern earth-sheltered homes are often luxury projects designed by prestigious architects for wealthy clients. The same essential approach, building into the land, using earth as construction material, carries opposite class connotations. There is irony here. The Viking settler who built a turf house because timber was unavailable and survival was at stake now has architectural descendants who build underground homes as statements of ecological consciousness and design sophistication. The motivation has inverted, but the form persists. Iceland itself has embraced this heritage. Turf houses, once demolished as embarrassments, are now protected as cultural landmarks. Tourism includes visits to preserved or reconstructed sites. The knowledge of traditional construction, nearly lost, is being deliberately transmitted to new generations. And in architecture schools, students study vernacular building traditions alongside modernist icons. They learn that innovation can mean looking backward as well as forward. They design projects that take seriously the accumulated wisdom of people who had no formal training, but solved problems of extraordinary difficulty. You would not recognize these sleek, technology-enhanced, environmentally controlled buildings as descendants of your smoky, crowded, livestock-sharing turf house. But the kinship is there. The understanding that the earth is not just a surface to build on, but a material to build with. The recognition that working with climate is wiser than fighting against it. The architect finishes her plans, closes her laptop, walks outside. Above her, the sky is the same sky you saw. The ground beneath her feet is made of the same materials you shaped into walls. The challenges are different, but the essential problem, how to create human shelter that respects natural limits, remains. Your solutions still speak to hers. Across 1,000 years, the conversation continues. The farmhouse at Stung has been waiting. It was buried by volcanic ash in 1104, when Mount Hekla erupted and rendered an entire valley uninhabitable. The people who lived here fled, abandoning their home and everything in it. The ash settled, layer upon layer, a protective blanket that would preserve what lay beneath for almost 900 years. When archaeologists excavated Stung in the 20th century, they found an extraordinarily complete picture of medieval Icelandic life. The turf walls had survived, their outlines clear beneath the volcanic overburden. The floor plan was intact, the main hall, the fire pit, the platforms along the walls. Even organic materials, usually the first to decay, had been protected by the ash. Stung became one of the best documented turf house sites in existence. And based on this documentation, a reconstruction was built nearby. Thjodveldisberinn, the Commonwealth Farm, a full-scale replica that allows visitors to experience what life in a medieval Icelandic farmstead was like. Similar preserved and reconstructed turf houses dot the Icelandic landscape. At Glaumber in northern Iceland, a cluster of 19th century turf buildings survives, maintained as a museum. The architecture is later, more evolved, but still recognisably descended from the same tradition you practiced. In Norway, at places like Lofoten, reconstructed Viking-era longhouses demonstrate the Scandinavian roots of turf construction. These are not identical to Icelandic versions. They have more access to timber, different proportions, regional variations, but the family resemblance is clear. Even at Lans o Meadows in Newfoundland, the Viking site includes reconstructed turf buildings. Visitors can enter the same kind of structure that sheltered the Vinland of explorers, feel the same darkness, smell the same earthy dampness. Historians still argue about the accuracy of these reconstructions. Every choice involves interpretation: what species of grass to use, how thick to make the walls, what style of furniture to include. The reconstructions are educated guesses, not photographic reproduction, but they serve a purpose that written descriptions cannot. They make the past tangible. They allow people to stand in a space, to look around, to feel the scale and atmosphere. They transform abstract historical knowledge into embodied experience. The experience is almost always the same. Visitors enter expecting something primitive and emerge with new respect. The spaces are warm, protective, surprisingly comfortable. The design makes sense in ways that are not immediately obvious, but become clear once you are inside. This is the real test of the turf house tradition. Not whether it meets modern building codes or suits contemporary tastes, but whether the solutions still work, still make sense, still solve the fundamental problems they were designed to address. And they do. The thermal performance, integration with landscape, the efficient use of available materials. All of these remain sound, still relevant, still instructive. You built your house to survive one winter. You did not imagine that 1,000 years later, people would travel from around the world to experience what you created, to understand how you lived, to carry forward the knowledge you developed. The farmhouse at Stung waited, buried under ash, preserved by catastrophe. Now it speaks again through the reconstruction that stands nearby, through the visitors who walk through its recreated spaces, through the continuing scholarship that analyses what the excavations revealed. Your voice, across a millennium, still tells its story. The wind is dying now. You have been travelling a long time tonight, across oceans and centuries, from Norwegian fjords to Icelandic hillsides, from settlement voyages to archaeological excavations. You have cut turf and built walls and survived winters that would kill most modern people. You have experienced smoke and darkness and the intimate presence of livestock. You have seen traditions rise and fall and rise again. Now, as the night deepens, as your eyes grow heavy, as the last threads of wakefulness begin to fray, you settle into your platform. Pull your wool blankets close and let the darkness gather around you like a familiar friend. The turf walls hold you. They have held your family for years now, held your ancestors for generations before that. The weight of earth above and around creates a silence that the outside world cannot penetrate. The wind that howled all winter, that drove snow horizontally across the landscape, that killed those who were not adequately sheltered, that wind is muffled here, reduced to a distant whisper. The fire has burned low. A few coals glow in the ash. Red and orange and the deep purple that comes just before ember becomes extinguished carbon. You do not rise to add fuel. Tonight the house has warmth enough. The thermal mass of the walls radiates what the day's fire stored. The animals breathe in their section, each exhalation adding to the collective warmth. Your breathing slows. Your muscles, tired from the endless work that survival demands, begin to release their tension. The darkness is complete now. No glimmer from the smoke hole, no flicker from dying flames. Just pure, absolute, embracing dark. Somewhere in the stories your grandmother told, there were worlds beneath the earth. Realms of dwarves and dead, of treasures and terrors. To live in a turf house was to occupy that boundary, to hover between the surface world of light and the buried world of mystery. You have spent your life on that threshold. Tomorrow there will be work. There is always work. Repairs to make, turf to cut, livestock to tend, fish to catch and dry, wool to spin and weave. The cycle of labour that sustains life continues, relentless as seasons. But tonight, this one night, you rest. The earth holds you. The darkness cradles you. The walls your hands built become the walls of sleep, and you pass through them as easily as smoke passes through turf, rising into whatever dreams await. The night grows quiet now, the way nights do when all the busy world has finally stilled its turning. If you're listening, you might hear your own breathing, slow and deep, the rhythm of someone settling into rest at last. The story of the turf houses has been told, and the tellers have gone to their beds, and the walls that sheltered them are doing what walls have always done, holding back what needs to be held back, holding in what needs to be kept. Think for just a moment longer of all those hands that cut the turf, all those backs that bent under the weight of earth blocks, all those fires that burned through all those winters. Think of the smoke that rose and dispersed, the breath that fogged in cold air, the dreams that came in the darkness and were forgotten by morning. 1,000 years of human effort, concentrated into grass and soil, pressed into walls that kept the cold at bay. And now, wherever you are, in a bed with proper blankets, in a room with proper walls, in a world that has mostly forgotten what it means to build shelter from nothing but what the land provides, you are the inheritor of all that effort. Not because you will cut turf tomorrow, but because you carry forward the fundamental human need they addressed. The need for warmth, for safety, for a place where the wind cannot reach you. Your eyelids are heavy now, the words are becoming softer, fainter, like the last light fading from a long winter afternoon. Let them fade. Let the stories settle into the place where stories go when they have done their work. Let sleep take you the way the earth took those Viking settlers, gently, completely, with the promise that morning will come when it comes, and until then you are held. The turf houses stood for centuries. Your rest tonight is just a few hours, but it is part of the same long tradition. Human beings finding ways to be safe and warm in a world that is often neither. So breathe, now. Let go, now. Let the darkness become comfortable, and the silence become soft, and the weight of the day become nothing at all. The walls are still there. The fire is still warm. The earth is still holding everything together, the way it always has, the way it always will. Sleep well. The wind has stopped. The night is gentle, and tomorrow when you wake you will remember just enough of this story to carry it forward, into the bright world, into the future, into whatever shelters you build for yourself and the ones you love. For now, though, rest. You have earned it.